Chapter 37. When Charles stepped into the banquet hall, he was full of confidence. When everyone looked at him in surprise, he was full of confidence. However, when the banquet hall fell into a long silence, he felt a little strange. He had specially prepared for tonight's outfit for a long time. He had even prepared an impassioned speech, waiting for someone to ask him, "Honorable Marquis, why are you wearing armor to attend the banquet?" But why didn't anyone ask? Marquis Charles was deeply disappointed. These people were too stupid. They didn't even know how to pass him a message. So, he coughed a few times and prepared to answer his own question. "You must be very curious why I'm not wearing a formal dress? Because I don't have the face to wear it." Marquis Charles took a deep breath and closed his eyes. When he opened them again, his eyes were filled with tears. The troll army retreated, but did we really win? All of you ask yourselves? When Marquis Charles said this, he swept his gaze across the hall with a bitter and hateful gaze. But at a certain spot he suddenly froze. Because he saw the maverick figure in the crowd at a glance, Colin. Then he felt unwell all over. Colin also saw Marquis Charles at this time. Then he felt unwell all over. "I wore armor to attend the banquet because I was forced by that crazy woman to the point that I had no choice." "What kind of show are you putting on?" The entire banquet hall was silent. 10 seconds had passed. 20 seconds had passed. 30 seconds had passed. "Night, Colin." Finally, Marquis Charles let out an affectionate roar, breaking the awkward silence that made one feel uneasy. He took a few quick steps and came in front of Colin. Colin faced Marquis Charles, who was wearing a couple's outfit with him, and instinctively panicked. He subconsciously retracted his hands. But unfortunately, however, it was still caught by Marquis Charles in a flash. "Night, Colin." Marquis Charles held Colin's hands tightly. "I knew that there would always be warriors like me on the northern frontier who are unwilling to indulge in false victories and who are brave enough to pick up weapons, don armor, and fight the trolls to the death." Colin resisted the urge to pull his hands back. He quickly adjusted the expression on his face and put on an impassioned look. "I, who should cooperate with you, can only do my best to perform." However, compared to the acting skills of Marquis Charles, Colin still felt a little inferior. For example, the other party's exquisite control of holding back the tears that welled up in his eyes. Colin knew that he couldn't do it. "Lord Marquis." Colin's voice gradually choked with sobs. "As long as I don't avenge my father, I won't take off my armor. Lord Marquis, please reorganize the army and lead us to attack the Sky Ice Plains. Don't worry, I won't let you down." The two best actors looked at each other affectionately. "But you've already disappointed us." A calm voice came from the entrance of the hall. The voice was not loud, but it made the entire hall quiet down. Moreover, this person's words revealed his disdain for Marquis Charles. However, no one present dared to refute him. Even Marquis Charles himself, although his carefully prepared performance was abruptly interrupted, he only showed an awkward and guilty expression when he heard the words. At the same time, the crowd immediately separated to both sides, making a spacious passage for the person at the door. Marquis Garcia appeared at the door. Vera, who was dressed up, followed behind him. The two armored men finally stopped looking at each other emotionally. They turned around and bowed to the two who walked into the hall at this time. Marquis Garcia was wearing a dark blue suit today. He had a cold expression on his face as he walked quickly through the crowd. When he passed by Colin and Marquis Charles, he did not stop. He did not even look at the two of them. It was as if he did not care about the farce caused by the two of them. As the person with the highest status in today's banquet, Marquis Garcia's attitude was very important. When they saw that he did not pay attention to the two armored men, all the nobles who attended the banquet breathed a sigh of relief. However, although Marquis Garcia was worthy of being the focus of today's banquet, the real focus of the banquet was someone else. At least, all the men at the banquet were looking at the slender and graceful figure behind Marquis Garcia. Of course, Colin was no exception. Vera was breathtakingly beautiful tonight. She was wearing a pure white dress with a slit. Her dazzling blonde hair was draped over her smooth shoulders, and her blue eyes were as pure as the sea. Her height of 1. 7 meters was extremely proportionate, and the tight-fitting dress highlighted every part of her body, weaving into mesmerizing curves. What made the male nobles at the banquet even more irresistible was that Vera had an almost perfect and delicate face. Moreover, the mystery of a mage, the dignity and elegance of a great noble, and the gentleness and grace of a young girl were perfectly combined on her body, exuding a fatal attraction. Who is she? Many of the male nobles had already begun to inquire about Vera's identity in a low voice. The adopted daughter of the Duke of St. Hilda was indeed very mysterious. Colin could not find any information about her in the memory of his predecessor. It was as if the Duke of St. Hilda was deliberately covering up her existence. However, Marquis Garcia seemed to be officially introducing this beauty to the people of the northern frontier today. Before the banquet begins, please allow me to formally introduce this beautiful lady next to me. Marquis Garcia led Vera to the high platform in the front row of the hall and introduced her, Vera St. Hilda, the adopted daughter of the Duke of St. Hilda. Wow, after hearing Vera's true identity, the eyes of the male nobles under the stage became even more blazing. There was only one thought left in their minds: to marry her. One must always have a dream. Otherwise, what was the difference between them and a salted fish? Marquis Garcia seemed to have seen through the thoughts of the crowd. Therefore, he did not delay any longer. He immediately picked up a wine glass and said loudly, "Tonight's banquet officially begins. Everyone enjoy yourselves. Praise the market." As soon as Marquis Garcia's voice fell, beautiful music began to play. The banquet officially began. As expected, Miss Vera was immediately surrounded by many male nobles of the right age. Regardless of their status, almost all of the unmarried men present wanted to have a try to see if they had a chance to win the heart of the beauty. After all, a woman like Vera, whose appearance and status could be said to be the best choice, was the best marriage partner. As for whether it was a good idea or not, they would have to give it a try first. Vera skillfully dealt with the nobles who came to talk to her, as if such a scene was nothing to her. Her every move revealed the temperament of the Duke's daughter, and she politely and firmly rejected the men who came to her. "Aren't you going to give it a try?" Marquis Charles nudged Colin, who was next to him, with his elbow. "Of course," Colin said with a calm look on his face. "But I have to give others a chance to try first." Marquis Charles could hear the strong confidence in Colin's words, and he was a little surprised. "Hey, don't blame me for not reminding you. There are many young men at the banquet today who are better than you in terms of status and appearance." Colin shrugged his shoulders and ignored Charles's warning. Instead, he picked up a glass of champagne from the tray of a passing waiter and tasted it carefully. When Marquis Charles saw this, he rolled his eyes and felt that he had been worrying for nothing. At this time, there were already many couples dancing in the center of the banquet hall. However, Vera had not accepted any invitation from any of the men yet. Finally, after waiting for the people around her to leave one by one, Colin put down his glass of champagne and walked towards Vera. "Beautiful and noble lady, may I have the honor of dancing with you?" Colin bowed slightly and stretched out his right hand towards Vera. Vera's face was slightly flushed, and she obediently placed her right hand in Colin's hand. "Okay." Chapter 38. Accompanied by the melodious music, pairs of men and women danced on the dance floor of the banquet hall. They were dancing the most traditional palace dance of the Empire of Light. It was similar to the Vienna waltz on Earth. The male and female dance partners needed to borrow each other's strength to complete a series of reverses, swings, and spins in a harmonious manner at a very fast speed. The entire dance was light, smooth, and elegant. In such a fast rotation, everything around them would become blurred, and only the face of the dance partner in their arms could be seen clearly. Spin, spin, and spin again. It was as if they were going to dance together until the end of time. However, the music would eventually come to an end. The song was over. Colin completed the last rotation with Vera, who was as light as a feather. Then he reluctantly withdrew his right hand from Vera's smooth back, stepped back slightly, and bowed. "Thank you, Miss Vera. This is the most unforgettable dance I have ever danced." Vera's small face was still red, and she was panting slightly. It seemed that she had not recovered from the dance just now. When she heard Colin's flattery, she smiled slyly. "Knight Colin, why do I feel that you have said this to many girls?" Colin raised his head and did not panic at all. He knew very well that at this time, what he should do was not to defend himself, but to attack. So, he smiled and said, "Please believe me, from now on, I will only say such words to you." Sure enough, Colin's slightly straightforward words made Vera feel a little overwhelmed. Sweet words. Vera snorted and rolled her eyes at Colin, but there was an embarrassed smile on her face. At this moment, Colin could already feel the gazes filled with killing intent all around him. Obviously, after successfully becoming Vera's first dance partner, Colin had naturally become the public enemy of all the male nobles present. However, he obviously did not care. He was determined to hug this thick thigh of Vera's, because he had already seen Earl Amon's figure in the crowd. The fear of being assassinated instantly shrouded Colin's heart, and he had no choice but to think of ways to raise his value so that the other party would be wary of him. After sending Vera back to Marquis Garcia's side, Colin politely said goodbye. He knew that going too far was as bad as falling short. Therefore, it would be foolish for him to continue pestering Vera at this time. But before he could walk far, a young man blocked in front of Colin. Was the supporting character that was sent to be slapped in the face already appearing so quickly? Colin smiled politely while letting his imagination run wild. "May I ask who you are?" The young man smiled coldly. "Knight Colin, I heard that you used my identity. Don't tell me you can't recognize me?" Colin paused for a moment and immediately realized who the person in front of him was. No wonder she looked familiar. She looked just as annoying as that crazy woman. They were indeed siblings. "So it's Knight Consudo. It's an honor to meet you," Colin said, but there was no respect in his eyes. Con was obviously very unhappy with Colin, and he said sarcastically, "Knight Colin, if the Honorable Miss Vera knew that the knight she was dancing with just now was actually a liar, how would she react?" Faced with Con's threat, Colin shrugged as if he did not care at all. "Why don't you try and find out?" Con's face suddenly sank, as if he could not tell whether Colin was really fearless or just pretending. But before he could continue to probe, Colin suddenly lowered his voice and said, "However, if I were you, I would first care about your good sister. What happened to my sister?" Seeing that the other party had taken the bait, Colin smiled and said, "You should know that the one who really led the army to reclaim Icestone City was your sister, Knight Cynthia. So, according to the rules of the feudal lord, shouldn't she be the one to inherit the title of Duke of the Pseudo family and not you?" Nonsense. Con was like a kitten whose tail had been stepped on, and he suddenly exploded. "I am the first in line to inherit the Pseudo family. You should save this kind of words for the Duke of St. Hilda." Colin spread his hands, indicating that this matter had nothing to do with him. Con almost could not control his anger when he saw this annoying look, and he stared fiercely at Colin, breathing heavily. It was as if he wanted to beat up this abominable person in front of him. But soon, Con calmed down, because a palm pressed on his shoulder. Con turned around, and his expression immediately became respectful. "Uncle?" Colin's pupils shrank as he looked at the person who had come, Count Aldman. "Lord Count." Colin carefully lowered his head, not wanting the other party to see the fear hidden in his eyes. Count Aldman was a mature and elegant middle-aged man. He always had a faint smile on his face, as if he was courteous to everyone. However, from time to time, his wine-red eyes would reveal a trace of hidden coldness, indicating that this count was not a kind and nice person. "Colin, I'm so happy to see that you're fine." Count Aldman patted Colin's shoulder lightly, his face brimming with a smile from the bottom of his heart. "I heard that you were assassinated in Grey Castle. What exactly happened? Who was so daring?" Colin raised his head, his face already wearing a friendly smile. "The assassin was Knight Carter. As for who ordered him to do it, it's still under investigation." "Carter?" Count Aldman snorted and said angrily, "That ungrateful wretch is a disgrace to the world of knights. Don't worry, I will send someone to investigate this matter. If there is any news, I will definitely inform you." "Thank you very much for your help, Lord Count." Colin looked at the righteous Count in front of him and suddenly felt that this person's acting skills were not inferior to Marquis Charles's. Count Aldman chuckled and said a few words of concern to Colin, as if he was really a friendly elder. Colin also dealt with him carefully, as if he had never suspected that his assassination had anything to do with this Count in front of him. Before leaving, Count Aldman lowered his voice and asked, "Did you and Marquis Charles discuss wearing armor to attend the banquet together?" "No, we just happened to think of the same thing." Colin found it strange that the other party would suddenly ask this. Count Aldman said meaningfully, "Oh, that's good then. But you have to be careful. Don't get too close to Marquis Charles." "But?" Colin asked directly. Count Aldman did not answer, but the Knight of Caen beside him mocked arrogantly. "Idiot. Marquis Charles lost so miserably this time, and lost 200,000 northern frontier troops. Does he not have to take responsibility for this? You actually dare to get close." "Shut up," Count Aldman growled. The Knight of Caen immediately shrank back, turning into a quail again. Count Aldman turned his head and said to Colin, "Remember, our loyalty will always be to the Duke of St. Hilda, not to some marquis." Looking at Count Aldman's departing figure, Colin suddenly narrowed his eyes. Only then did he realize that tonight's banquet seemed to be brewing a dangerous undercurrent. Chapter 39. People were divided into different classes. The nobles were no exception. There were big nobles, small nobles, and knights who were nobles but not completely nobles. This banquet of the Sue-Duo family was divided into such a clear hierarchy. Marquis Garcia, Marquis Charles, and Vera. These three were the core circle of the banquet. Countless people tried their best to get close to them, but they only dared to greet them for a short while. They did not dare to stay for long. Otherwise, they would be considered rude and overestimating themselves. Outside the core circle, there was a circle led by Earl Alman. There were 3 earls gathered here, as well as the host of the banquet, the Sue-Duo family. Further out were a group of viscounts and barons. The last circle, which was also the most numerous, was the knights, including Colin. In fact, strictly speaking, Colin was also qualified to go to the circle of barons. However, he had now realized that this banquet was not as simple as it seemed on the surface, so he began to deliberately reduce his presence. He was prepared to be a qualified bystander. Although Colin and Marquis Charles seemed to appreciate each other before, if the Marquis was really unable to protect himself, then Colin would never let himself be dragged into the water in order to help him. If it was Vera, then Colin might consider how to save the damsel in distress. But Marquis Charles, who liked to pull people, cry, and act hee-hee, good luck. The banquet was still going on, but the atmosphere seemed to have quietly changed. The music was still going on, but the center of the dance floor was already empty. Even though he was in the outermost circle of the banquet, Colin had already felt that the atmosphere around him had begun to become heavy. With his enhanced hearing at night, Colin eavesdropped on the discussions of the knights around him. He did not know when it started, but everyone had stopped talking about this lucking victory and turned the topic to their own losses. Indeed, the series of defeats commanded by Marquis Charles had almost destroyed 200,000 troops on the northern frontier. Of these, half of them were under the direct command of the House of St. Hilda, but the other half were the private armies of the various feudal lords of the northern frontier. In addition, the territories near the front lines had been conquered by the trolls. Even if they had reclaimed them now, the trolls would not return empty-handed. Therefore, this time, the lords of the northern frontier suffered heavy losses. Someone had to take responsibility for such a heavy loss. Thus, the topic gradually became unfavorable to Marquis Charles. Of course, the House of St. Hilda still had its prestige, so no one dared to rebuke the House of St. Hilda directly. They could only make a few indirect complaints. In Colin's opinion, such complaints wouldn't hurt Marquis Charles's foundation at all. At most, it would make his reputation a little worse. Perhaps it would make the House of St. Hilda feel guilty for this crushing defeat. Perhaps they would compensate the lords a little later, but that was all. If Count Alman hadn't been bluffing earlier, this little action shouldn't have been the main dish of this banquet. Thus, Colin continued to wait. As expected, Colin waited for a truly explosive piece of news. Did you hear? This time, Marquis Garcia led the black cavalry to reinforce the front lines without the Duke's orders. What do you mean? Are you saying Marquis Garcia sent his troops on his own? That's right. That's why the Marquis stopped in Icestone City. He's waiting for the Duke's orders. He already sent his troops on his own. Why is he still waiting for orders? Shoo. Why are you being so loud? Are you looking for death? Colin was speechless. These people seemed to be whispering, but they didn't try to hide it at all. Moreover, he had already discovered that this rumor had spread throughout the banquet. At this moment, he suddenly realized what was going on with this hidden undercurrent. Without a doubt, Marquis Charles was still the true target of these people. However, he was still the Duke's eldest son, and the House of St. Hilda's prestige was unparalleled in the northern frontier. The lords and nobles who had suffered heavy losses could only be angry at Marquis Charles, but they didn't dare to say anything. However, if someone was leading them, then it would be different. This person had already made his position clear. The first time he saw Marquis Charles after his troops had been defeated, he had whipped him in public. Before tonight's banquet began, he had once again interrupted a carefully planned performance by Marquis Charles. This Heech was naturally the commander of the Black Cavalry, the #1 person in the Northern Frontier Army, the Duke's younger brother, Marquis Garcia. Only when Marquis Garcia clearly expressed his dislike for Marquis Charles did the other nobles dare to complain behind him. However, at first, they only stopped at complaining. However, when everyone knew that Marquis Garcia had secretly mobilized the Black Cavalry without the Duke's orders, the situation changed. Although the Black Cavalry was Marquis Garcia's private army, in name, of course, they were under the Marquis command. However, this was the northern frontier after all. The Duke of St. Hilda was the real owner here. Moreover, the Black Cavalry had already left the Marquis territory. Shouldn't they have gotten the Duke's approval first? Therefore, for some reason, this rumors that had spread throughout the banquet vaguely revealed a signal. It was a dangerous signal. Marquis Garcia and the Duke of St. Hilda were not on good terms. In fact, a smart person would have noticed the Duke of St. Hilda's fear of his own brother when he hid the Black Cavalry 3 years ago. However, at that time, Marquis Garcia did not disobey his brother's orders. But now, could it be that after the crushing defeat of Marquis Charles, Marquis Garcia was finally dissatisfied with his brother's nepotism and started to take the initiative to rebel? After all, the Black Cavalry was an extremely terrifying army. Although there were only 50,000 people, no one doubted that in the hands of Marquis Garcia, they could not sweep the northern frontier. Moreover, due to the crushing defeats of Marquis Charles, the military strength of the northern frontier had been severely weakened. In this way, the Black Cavalry seemed even more terrifying. That was why this piece of gossip had such a terrifying effect. Marquis Garcia had repeatedly humiliated Marquis Charles. Did he really want to teach the younger generation a lesson, or did he want to take the opportunity to express his dissatisfaction with the Duke of St. Hilda? He then thought of Earl Oman's hint and the current turbulent undercurrent in the banquet. Colin suddenly realized that a terrifying storm was brewing. Once it took shape, it would have the terrifying power to sweep through the entire northern frontier. Just as the atmosphere in the banquet was becoming more and more serious, Knight Consudo suddenly appeared in front of Marquis Charles. He first bowed respectfully, then raised his head and asked in a righteous tone, "What's the matter?" "Sir Marquis, I would like to ask, for the crushing defeat of the northern frontier this time, should someone take responsibility for it?" Marquis Charles was stunned. Marquis Garcia was expressionless. The entire banquet was silent. The storm had officially arrived. Chapter 40. Consudo felt a little smug as he enjoyed the attention of everyone. Especially Miss Vera's clear gaze. Con was so excited that his face turned red and his whole body trembled. The heir of the Suduo family suddenly felt that if he went to ask Miss Vera for a dance now, he might not be rejected like before. He felt that he was a hero now. However, Colin looked at him as if he was looking at an idiot. He did not expect that this guy would be the one to stand up for him. All the nobles present were excited when they saw the Knight of Con questioning Marquis Charles. Except for one person. This person was Con's sister, Cynthia Sue Duo, the crazy woman Colin called Cynthia Sue Duo. She looked at her brother with eyes full of horror. Why did this banquet, which was supposed to make the Sue Duo family famous, become like this? If possible, she just wanted to seal her brother's mouth and lock him in the basement, never letting him out. Cynthia knew very well that Marquis Charles might have really angered everyone, but he was still the first heir of the House of St. Hilda. Her brother was just the heir of the Viscounts, so what right did he have to question him? No, although her brother was stupid, he was definitely not someone who had the guts to do so. Otherwise, when Cynthia led her army to reclaim Icestone City, he would not have continued to hide in Fallen Eagle City. Thinking of this, she suddenly turned to look at Earl Aldman. It seemed that this good uncle had whispered something in her brother's ear, causing Con to rush forward. Cynthia felt a chill in her heart. She suddenly felt that the future of the Sue Duo family seemed to be bleak. Knight of Con, you are right. Marquis Charles did not care about the other party's offense at all. He took a deep breath and asked sincerely, "Then, what kind of punishment do you think can make up for my previous mistakes?" Con did not expect Marquis Charles to be so easy to talk to. At this time, when he saw the dignified Marquis waiting for his judgment so humbly, Con trembled even more. However, after the excitement, Con also felt a little lost. He opened his mouth but did not dare to say what punishment was suitable for Marquis Charles. Quietly turning his head, Con looked at his uncle, Earl Yuman, with a pleading gaze. But Count Almond's head was lowered, as though he had no idea what was going on. Con's heart sank. However, just as he was about to retreat, he suddenly saw Vera staring at him. In Con's eyes, it was a gaze filled with encouragement, admiration, and even admiration. Thus, the Knight of Con was once again filled with power. Even the pimple on his nose was faintly glowing red. For a moment, he felt that he was super brave. "My title!" Con's sharp voice echoed in the hall. "As punishment, you should voluntarily give up your Marquis title." Whoosh, everyone was stunned. Even Marquis Charles, who had always been outstanding in acting, did not know how to react. Colin looked at Con with eyes full of pity. This was a look of concern for the mentally retarded. At this time, Cynthia's face was full of despair. She did not know whether the title of Marquis Charles could be kept, but it seemed that the title of Viscounts of the Sue Duo family would be lost. The title of Marquis Charles was a fake, and it represented his qualifications as the first successor of the Duke of St. Hilda. It also represented the face of the Duke of St. Hilda. Asking Marquis Charles to give up his title was no longer a punishment for Charles, but a slap in the face of the Duke of St. Hilda. It was forcing the Lord of the Northern Frontier to admit his mistake. It was forcing him to abdicate. The music finally stopped. The atmosphere in the banquet hall was so stagnant that it was almost suffocating. The eyes of the audience were focused on Marquis Charles and the Knight of Con. The Knight of Con originally enjoyed the feeling of being the focus of the audience, but now he felt uneasy. Cold sweat dripped down from his forehead. Con once again looked for the gaze of the goddess in his heart, Vera. But Vera was no longer looking at him at this time. Instead, she was looking at her brother, Marquis Charles, with a worried look. Con's face instantly turned pale, as if he finally realized what a stupid thing he had done. Marquis Charles's face was also very ugly at this time. He also did not know how to deal with it. He could not agree to give up his title, and he did not dare to agree to it. This was no longer a matter of his honor and disgrace alone. It involved his father's face, and even the prestige of the House of St. Hilda. Since when did the Lord of the Northern Region allow a bunch of inferior nobles to tell him what to do when it came to his successor? Marquis Charles did not look at the uneasy Con again. This idiot was just a gun that was pushed out. He looked past Con and slowly swept across the audience. But he did not see any friendly and supportive eyes. At this time, he gradually realized that this storm was probably premeditated. It was not only against him, but also against his father. Then all the more he couldn't back down. If he took a step back, he would be smashed to pieces. So, Marquis Charles took a few steps forward, walked past Con, and faced the nobles in the hall. With a serious expression, he said, "Anyone else who thinks that I should give up my title, please stand up." He did not want to pay attention to Khan, who was just a puppet. Instead, he wanted to force the real mastermind behind the scenes to come out. Moreover, he did not believe that the House of St. Hilda, which had ruled the northern frontier for thousands of years, would be in danger of falling apart immediately after a fiasco. The audience was silent. The House of St. Hilda had been in power for thousands of years, and it was not a simple matter in the northern frontier. So, the banquet became awkward again. After a long time, a voice finally broke the silence. "Oh, I'm sorry, Marquis Charles. Khan is still young and insensible. If his words offended you, I hope that you can forgive him." The one who stood up was Earl Oman. However, he did not continue to target Marquis Charles. Instead, he excused Khan. He also gave Marquis Charles a way out. Colin suddenly had some doubts. Could it be that Earl Oman was really loyal to the Duke of St. Hilda and did not participate in this conspiracy against Marquis Charles? But very quickly, Earl Oman's next sentence dispelled Colin's previous thoughts. "Marquis Garcia, what punishment do you think is suitable for Marquis Charles's previous mistakes?" When Marquis Garcia heard this, he seemed to have woken up from his relaxed state of being a bystander. Under everyone's gaze, he slowly stood up and walked to the front of the stage, standing side by side with Marquis Charles. Marquis Charles could only bow slightly, take half a step back, and give up the center position. Facing the Knight of Khan, Earl Oman, or any of the nobles present, Marquis Charles would not back down. However, Marquis Garcia was an exception, because this commander of the Black Cavalry really had the ability to flip the table. Marquis Charles was not sure whether his uncle wanted to flip the table or not. Was all of this caused by the nobles of the northern frontier who were dissatisfied with him, or was it secretly planned by Marquis Garcia? If it was the former, Charles was not too worried. If it was the latter, false? Marquis Garcia finally spoke. "Uncle." Marquis Charles lowered his head slightly, waiting for the trial with a heart full of anxiety. 200,000 northern frontier soldiers. What are you going to use to atone for your crimes? Kaboom! Marquis Charles felt as if he was struck by lightning. He was stunned on the spot. What else could he use to atone for his crimes? Marquis Charles raised his head in shock, looking at his uncle with a face full of shock. It was as if he was truly seeing him for the first time. Colin watched this scene from afar, and a word flashed in his mind. The dagger was revealed. Chapter 41. It was already late into the night. The grand banquet in Icestone City had finally come to an end. However, the nobles that left the banquet had different expressions on their faces. Some were excited, some were terrified, some were expectant, some were fearful. Tonight was destined to be a sleepless night. Carrier pigeons took off from Icestone City one after another, dispersing towards the northern frontier. They were going to deliver an earth-shattering piece of news. The eldest son of the Duke of St. Hilda, Marquis Charles, had announced that he would renounce his title under the questioning of Marquis Garcia. Charles's title was an empty title in the first place, and it didn't have any corresponding territory. What it truly represented was the inheritance rights of the Duke of St. Hilda. Renouncing this title meant that Charles had renounced his inheritance rights. Of course, strictly speaking, only when the Duke of St. Hilda approved Charles's request would he be officially stripped of his title as a marquis and lose his inheritance rights. However, what was truly thought-provoking, or perhaps even more frightening, was that Charles was forced by his own uncle to renounce his title. Since Charles wouldn't inherit the title of the Duke of the House of St. Hilda, then who would inherit it? Would it be the Duke's second son? Or would it be the Duke's younger brother? Logically speaking, as the Duke's younger brother, Marquis Garcia's inheritance rights should be behind the Duke's 3 sons, and even behind the Duke's adopted daughter, Vera. But now, no one could be sure who would inherit the title of the House of St. Hilda. And would that golden lion flag become a black lion? A terrifying storm was quietly approaching the empire's northern frontier. Some people were overjoyed, trying to take advantage of this opportunity to rise. There were also people who were deeply worried, scared out of their wits by the hidden danger. Colin quietly walked on the streets of Icestone City, thinking about how the Angeli family would deal with the upcoming storm. To be honest, he didn't want the northern frontier to become chaotic at this time. This was not because he was loyal to the Duke of St. Hilda, or because he sympathized with Marquis Charles, nor was he worried that this storm would involve Vera. Instead, it was because he knew very well that if the northern frontier fell into civil strife at this time, who would benefit the most? Without a doubt, it would be the trolls. After all, the 300,000 troll army on Firmament Icefield hadn't retreated very far. They might even be eyeing the northern frontier right now. Once Marquis Garcia and the Duke of St. Hilda got into a fight, the trolls would definitely take the opportunity to invade the south again. The northern frontier would also be plunged into misery and suffering. Colin did not care about the power struggles of those in power, but as a human, he certainly did not want to see the northern frontier become a place where the trolls wreaked havoc. However, it was a pity that his words carried little weight and could not change the current situation. He could only hope that the Dukes of the North, who were far away in Winter City, would retain a trace of rationality and make appropriate concessions. Colin returned to the inn, removed his armor, and fell asleep immediately. When he woke up, the sun was just right. Although the atmosphere in Icestone City was slightly tense, there was no chaos. It was as if everything that happened last night was just an illusion. After breakfast, Colin went out for a walk and walked his cat. Of course, Little White wasn't too willing to be walked, but Colin insisted on dragging it out. After his protests were ineffective, the angry Little White burrowed into Colin's clothes and continued to sleep. Actually, Colin was not really wandering aimlessly on the streets. He had a destination, the Church of Glory. The Church of Glory in Icestone City was not far from the west side of the Sioux Duo Castle. It was a tall tower made of pure white rock that seemed to be close to 100 meters tall. The sharp top of the tower stood upright as if it was going to pierce the sky. Colin was no longer as fearful of the Church of Glory as he was when he first transmigrated. After all, he had already drunk the holy water and even advanced because of it. Actually, when he successfully advanced into an official knight and could activate the energy of the holy light, Colin already had a guess. The vampires of this world should not be restrained by the church. Thus, he openly walked through the church's door. The guards at the door saw that Colin was dressed extravagantly and did not stop him. In the spacious prayer hall, there was no one. There were only rows of tables and chairs and a statue erected in the front row. The statue was naturally the image of the God of Glory. It was a middle-aged man wearing a simple robe. His long hair draped over his shoulders. He held a scepter in his right hand and his left hand pointed forward. The only strange thing was his face. There were no facial features. According to the church, the reason why the God of Glory did not have facial features was because he could be anyone's image, an elegant noble, a poor commoner, or even a lowly slave. Colin raised his head to look at the legendary God who protected mankind, and an inexplicable sense of familiarity suddenly emerged in his heart. He thought for a long time but could not figure out where this sense of familiarity came from. "Honorable Knight, is there anything I can help you with?" Just as Colin was thinking about the statue of the God of Glory, an old voice suddenly woke him up. "Hello, Honorable Pastor, please call me Colin." The old pastor's turbid eyes flashed slightly and smiled. "So it's Knight Colin. I've heard of your name." Colin was a little surprised. Obviously, he did not expect that he was already so famous now. The old pastor seemed to see Colin's doubts and explained with a smile. "Previously, Archbishop Raven came here and mentioned you to me." Colin suddenly realized that he had left a deep impression on Archbishop Raven. He probably remembered that he had drunk a whole bottle of pure holy water. Stingy bishop. Colin cursed in his heart, but on the surface, he looked deeply honored. "I didn't expect Archbishop Raven to remember me. What an honor. May I know what brings you here, Knight Colin?" "Well, I actually want to buy some holy water so that I can save myself if I'm seriously injured next time." Since the last advancement, Colin had the idea of the church's holy water. Now that he had some free time, he naturally wanted to get some holy water to drink. "So that's how it is. Then please follow me." The old pastor nodded and led Colin through the prayer hall to the back hall. In fact, it was normal for the church to sell holy water. Moreover, the price was extremely expensive. The church did not feel ashamed of this, but justified it. God's gift comes with a price. The two quickly came to a small house in the back hall. The furnishings in the house were simple, with only a bathtub-sized holy water pool in the center. The surface of the pool was as smooth as a mirror, with a milky white holy light. Of course, this was holy water, but it was diluted. Colin resisted the urge to loot the church and handed the water bag to the old pastor. "Please fill it up for me." Gulp. Gulp. The old pastor quickly filled the water bag and returned it to Colin. "Knight Colin, a total of 30 gold coins? What a scam." One had to know that this holy water was diluted, not the pure holy water that Archbishop Raven had given Colin to drink. As for how many times it was diluted, according to Colin's understanding, the church's common practice was 1,000 times. Therefore, the true content of all the holy water in the church's holy water pool in front of him was probably not as concentrated as the small bottle in Archbishop Raven's hands. And now, the entire water bag that Colin had spent a huge sum of money to buy was probably diluted from 1 or 2 drops of pure holy water. Colin felt a pang of pain, but he could only hand the 30 gold coins to the old pastor. "Let's see if it works first." Colin bid farewell to the old pastor and left the black shop. Chapter 42. Burp. Strolling on the streets of Icestone City, Colin rubbed his stomach and burped. He had just come out of the church and drank his fill. However, the advancement he was looking forward to didn't come. Even his body didn't heat up. Colin thought that it probably wouldn't take effect that quickly. He needed some time to react, so he waited patiently. They waited from early morning until the sun set in the west. Still no reaction. At noon, he felt a slight heat in his body. However, it wasn't obvious. Could it be that the dosage was too low? Colin was a bit confused. However, he was also a bit helpless. Last time, Archbishop Raven had extravagantly used an entire bottle of pure holy water to save him because of Vera and Marquis Garcia. Now, if he wanted to get some holy water to drink, he could only buy it with money. However, when he thought of the expensive price, Colin felt a pang of pain. He was afraid that even if the Angeli family went bankrupt, it would only be enough to buy that pool of holy water in the Church of Icestone City. However, with that diluted holy water, it probably wouldn't be enough for him to advance to the 3rd rank. Depressed, Colin went to the small tavern next to the hotel and ordered a cup of deer blood wine to drown his sorrows. Night once again enveloped Icestone City. Colin's hearing also became more sensitive at night. Therefore, the slightly drunk Colin began to sit in the tavern while eavesdropping on all kinds of gossip. After listening for a while, Colin found that the most discussed topic was the banquet last night where Marquis Garcia forced Marquis Charles to give up his title. Moreover, most of the people thought that Marquis Garcia's actions were very appropriate. Marquis Charles had to pay the price for his previous defeat. However, not many people realized how big of an impact this matter would have on the northern frontier. This wasn't surprising. After all, they were just a bunch of ignorant commoners. What did they know about politics? Many people did not really support Marquis Garcia. They just wanted to see Marquis Charles suffer. Just like how the arrest of a corrupt official would always cause the masses to cheer, the tragic experience of a superior would always give the inferiors some psychological balance. As for whether this superior really deserved it or not, that was secondary. In addition to the unlucky Marquis Charles, the other person who was the most talked about in the pub was the Duke's adopted daughter, Miss Vera, who was making her first public appearance at the northern frontier. This was especially so when it was late at night and they drank more wine. Everyone gradually forgot about Marquis Charles, and Miss Vera's name became the new focus of discussion. Some people even described Vera's appearance as if they had seen her with their own eyes. There were also some people who were mysteriously talking about Vera's true identity as a sorcerer, and this immediately attracted a lot of attention. Colin took a closer look at the person who had revealed Vera's identity as a sorcerer, and he found that the person looked a little familiar. He guessed that the person was someone who had experienced that great escape together with him. However, he did not care much about it. Among the people who had escaped together with him, Colin only wanted to find the filial son, Sar, and teach him a good lesson. However, some of the comments about Vera in the pub later attracted Colin's attention. This was because many people were speculating about Vera's biological parents. Colin suddenly discovered that Vera's biological parents seemed to be a mystery. However, since she was chosen by the Duke of St. Hilda to be his adopted daughter, Vera's biological parents must also be great nobles. Who could they be? Just as Colin was lost in his thoughts, he suddenly heard some drunkards saying very disrespectful words about Miss Vera. Some of their words were really unpleasant to the ears. Colin was furious when he heard these words and he was about to beat these idiots to a pulp. However, he found that someone had already beaten him to it. As a result, the pub instantly became lively. There were people who were fighting, people who were watching, and people who were cheering. Some of them pretended to stop the fight, but in fact, they were deliberately instigating the fight. Some of them were just watching the fight but were accidentally injured. Some of them were so excited that they even joined the fight. The whole scene was chaotic and it was full of hormones that had nowhere to vent. The owner of the pub was the only one who was trying to stop the fight with a sad face. However, these drunkards who were provoked by Vera's name could only vent their anxiety through the most primitive physical conflict. How could they be stopped by a few words of persuasion? Colin ordered another glass of deer blood wine as he sat in the corner and watched with great interest. Finally, the fierce fight attracted a team of city guards. In front of the fully armed soldiers, these drunkards suddenly lost their temper and were subdued one by one. They were then squatted on the ground to be interrogated. According to the punishment for private fights in the city, these people had to pay a fine of 30 copper coins. Otherwise, they would have to stay in prison for 10 days. Some of them paid the fine honestly. However, there were also some poor people who could not even afford 30 copper coins. There were also some who would rather stay in prison. The latter two were naturally taken away by the city guards. The pub suddenly became a lot more spacious. However, it also became a lot more boring. Colin finished his glass of wine and was about to go back to sleep when he suddenly saw an acquaintance walking in. Knight Bliss. Yes, the person who came in was the knight of the House of St. Hilda who had escaped with Colin. Knight Bliss followed the voice and found Colin. There was a rare smile on his cold face as he walked over and sat down next to Colin. Your right hand? Colin noticed that the other party's right arm was empty. After the battle at the Rapids River, Colin directly fell into a coma. Knight Bliss had received orders from Marquis Garcia and left before Colin woke up. Therefore, Colin did not know that Bliss had become a one-armed hero. It's nothing. I was injured in the battle at the Rapids River. Knight Bliss said casually. Seeing that the other party did not want to say more, Colin did not dwell on this topic and asked, "What would you like to drink?" "It's on me." "What are you drinking?" "Deer blood wine." Knight Bliss looked at Colin in surprise. It seemed that he did not expect the seemingly gentle Baron heir to have such a strong taste. "Then give me a cup of the same." Colin smiled and ordered a cup of deer blood wine for Bliss. After the battle at the Rapids River, where did you go? Winter City. Colin's eyes narrowed slightly and quickly asked, "Where did you go?" But he seemed to realize something and quickly added, "If it's not convenient to say, then forget it." It's not inconvenient. After the battle at the Rapids River, Knight Bliss seemed to have recognized Colin and seemed to have a stance of not hiding anything. "I was ordered by Marquis Garcia to go to Winter City to ask the Duke for a military order." Colin thought to himself, as expected. Then he asked again, "So, what military order did you bring back?" This time, Knight Bliss hesitated slightly, but he still said, "The Duke ordered Marquis Garcia to command the Black Cavalry to pursue the Troll army that was retreating from the northern frontier." Chapter 43. The news of the Duke's military order quickly spread throughout Icestone City. The city was filled with a scene of jubilation. Everyone believed that as long as Marquis Garcia personally took action, then this battle of revenge would be a sure thing. Of course, saying it was a sure thing was already being modest. After all, ever since the Black Cavalry had officially formed an army, they had never tasted defeat. However, Colin wasn't very happy. Moreover, as the days went by, his worries grew deeper. Because Marquis Garcia didn't seem to have any plans to lead his troops north. Moreover, the private armies of the various lords of the northern frontier were continuously converging towards Icestone City, almost turning the entire city into a huge military camp. As more and more soldiers entered Ice Stone City, the confidence of the people in the city also grew. In their eyes, this should be the various lords responding to Marquis Garcia's call to gather their troops and cooperate with the Black Cavalry to attack the Sky Ice Plains. However, Colin, who knew the original text of the Duke's military order, wasn't so optimistic. Because he clearly remembered that Knight Bliss had personally told him that the Duke's order was for Marquis Garcia to lead the Black Cavalry to chase after the trolls, but never for him to gather the private armies of the various lords to attack together. Could it be that Marquis Garcia had lied about the Duke's military order? What was he planning to do by gathering so many troops? Was he really planning to attack the Sky Ice Plains? Or, Colin's bad premonition became more and more serious. For the next 10 days, the Black Cavalry still didn't make any moves, but the private armies of the various lords of the northern frontier were gathering more and more. Seeing that the situation was about to slide into the most dangerous abyss, and that Ice Stone City was about to become a huge barrel of gunpowder, Colin had already made plans to escape. However, at this time, he suddenly received a message from Vera. "Miss Vera wants to see me?" Under the gaze of the maid, Colin hesitated for a while before finally sighing, "All right, lead the way." The maid led Colin into the Sioux Duo clan's castle and arrived at a garden in the backyard of the castle. In the garden, Colin saw Vera's figure at a glance. After not seeing her for a long time, this female mage had lost a lot of weight. It seemed that she was also worried about the current tense situation. "Colin, you're here." Vera looked calm and serene under the morning sun. She wasn't dressed in noble attire today. Instead, she was dressed casually. She was wearing a thin white shirt and a short black skirt. There was a small rose embroidered on the left breast of the shirt and the corner of the skirt. However, even with such a simple disguise, it was hard to hide her beauty. When Colin came in, she was concentrating on taking care of a plant in the garden. After seeing Colin, Vera smiled and waved at him, as though she was a young girl who was waving at her first love. He didn't know why, but as soon as he saw Vera, Colin's anxious heart suddenly calmed down. He walked over and bowed. "Good morning, Miss Vera." "Good morning, Colin. Have you had breakfast?" "Yes, I have." "Then, would you like something to drink?" "Coffee." Vera gestured for the maid to bring a cup of coffee. Colin thanked him and took it. He took a sip. After the rich bitterness entered his mouth, it turned into a faint sweetness, with a fragrance that seeped into his soul. "Not bad, right?" Vera smiled when she saw Colin's expression. "This is the Sioux Duo clan's treasure." "Ha, then I am still taking advantage of you." Colin held the cup of coffee and squatted down beside Vera. He looked at the plant in front of her and asked, "Is this the flower that you planted?" "This is not a flower." Vera shook her head. "This is the twin grass. It is an extremely precious plant for mages. Moreover, I did not plant it. It was given to me by the Knight of Con." "Is that so?" It seems that the Knight of Con is really generous. First, he gave her a cup of coffee, and then he gave her a precious plant. Did this Knight of Con empty the Sioux Duo clan's coffers just to please Vera? Although Colin praised this kind of man on the surface, he was already cursing him in his heart. TSK. This kind of man could be said to be the public enemy of all men. This was because their behavior raised the psychological expectations of girls and greatly damaged the interests of other men. For example, Colin did not know what gift to give to Vera now. He did not know what gift to give her. He could not even afford to give her a better gift. Vera did not know what the man next to her was thinking. She stared at the twin grass in front of her and suddenly sighed. "Do you know? This twin grass looks like a single plant, but it is actually a pair. Ever since it was born, the branches of this pair of twin grass have been entangled together to support each other. However, because they are entangled too tightly, they torture each other. Do you see that drop of light green juice? That is the result of their branches entangling and squeezing each other." As she was speaking, the drop of juice gradually formed and suddenly fell to the ground. When it fell to the ground, it did not seep into the soil. Instead, it turned into an amber-like green gem. Vera carefully picked up the green gem and explained, "This is the crystallization of the twin grass's juice." It is an extremely precious spell-casting material. However, this is actually the blood and tears that they shed when they torture each other. This was the first time that Colin had seen such a magical plant. He could not help but look at it a few more times out of curiosity. However, he immediately realized that Vera's words seemed to be implying something. The Duke of St. Hilda and Marquis Garcia. Was the relationship between the two brothers similar to this twin grass? Were they supporting each other, but at the same time, they were also fighting against each other? Vera put away the crystal of the twin grass. She then turned around and said to Colin, "You should know that my father and uncle are in a bad situation right now. So, can you help me persuade them?" Your father and uncle are in a bad situation right now. Colin was speechless. However, on the surface, he comforted her and said, "Don't worry, nothing will happen. However, I am an outsider. It is not easy to persuade them. Have you tried to persuade them yourself?" "Of course I have." Vera puffed up her cheeks and seemed to be a little angry. "However, my uncle did not listen to my advice at all. As for my father, I have already written 2 letters and sent them to Winter City. However, both letters have been ignored." Colin was silent. Vera was a little anxious. "Do you know? Recently, I have received news that the Golden Lion Legion has begun to assemble. It seems that they are planning to march towards Icestone City." Colin was shocked. The Golden Lion Legion was the direct army of the House of St. Hilda. If this army was also mobilized, did it not mean that the Duke of St. Hilda had already shown that he would not compromise and was even prepared to die together with them? "Colin, you are always able to come up with a solution in a desperate situation. This time, you must help me." In the face of Vera's gentle request, Colin could not say no at all. At this time, he finally understood what it meant to be a femme fatale. "I will go with you to see Marquis Garcia." "Thank you, Colin. Don't be happy too early. I can only try my best to persuade them. As for whether it will succeed, whether it succeeds or not, I will be grateful." Chapter 44. Is the Marquis not in the castle? Yes, the Marquis has gone to the outskirts of the city to hunt. Colin and Vera both failed to find the Marquis Garcia in the castle at the moment. "Then, can I trouble you to take us to see him?" "Of course, it would be my pleasure." In the face of Vera's request, the Marquis bodyguard certainly would not refuse. Therefore, Colin followed the Marquis bodyguard to the stable to get the horse while Vera went back to change into a set of clothes that was more convenient for riding a horse. When Colin arrived at the stable, he bumped into an old acquaintance. "Good morning, Knight Cynthia." Colin greeted her with a smile on his face, but in his heart, he was already cursing her as a crazy woman. Cynthia seemed to have just come back from outside and she was stunned when she saw Colin. She then asked him with an unhappy expression on her face, "What are you doing here?" "I am not here to look for you." Colin saw that this crazy woman was being so rude and he could not help but retort back. Cynthia glared at him and her right hand reached for the sword that was on her waist. Colin was shocked. This woman was really crazy. She wanted to start a fight because of a disagreement? The Marquis bodyguard who was standing next to them was also shocked by the two of them and he did not understand the situation at all. However, when he saw that the situation was getting out of hand, he quickly stood up and explained. "Knight Cynthia, Knight Colin was invited to the castle by Miss Vera. He is now going to the outskirts of the city to meet the Marquis Garcia." Cynthia was about to scold the bodyguard when she saw that he dared to interrupt her. However, when she heard the name Marquis Garcia and saw the black lion emblem on the other party's breastplate, she suddenly stopped. She had to look at the owner before she hit the dog. The bodyguard of the Marquis Garcia was not an ordinary bodyguard. Although Cynthia was crazy, she was not stupid. When Colin saw that Cynthia was scared, he was about to say a few words to ridicule her. However, when he turned around and saw the servant who was holding the horse for Cynthia, he suddenly smiled. It was another old acquaintance. "Filialson, sir." "Knight Cynthia, the servant holding your horse looks good. Are you willing to sell him?" "Not for sale." Cynthia rejected without even thinking about it. Colin wasn't surprised by Cynthia's answer. Instead, he said calmly, "Don't be in a hurry to reject me. Don't you want to hear my offer? Cynthia's sword-like eyebrows rose slightly. After a moment of hesitation, she nodded and said, "Then tell me about it." Hearing this, Colin's lips immediately curled up. He took the bait. Even though Sar kept his head down, Colin still keenly noticed his clenched fists and his body instantly stiffening. He was a poisonous snake. This was Night Bliss' evaluation of Sar. Colin couldn't agree more. A person who could even betray his own father, what else couldn't he betray? Cynthia thought that if she protected Sar, Sar would be grateful. However, Colin was very clear that as long as Cynthia revealed the slightest intention of selling Sar to Colin, then the seed of hatred would be planted in Sar's heart. 10 gold coins? Colin said casually. Cynthia sneered, "Night, Colin, is your Angeli family already so poor? If you want to buy a servant at this price, I suggest you go to the slave market in the west of the city." To be honest, 10 gold coins was not a low price. Of course, it wasn't high either. In fact, as long as Colin's price didn't far exceed what Sar was worth, then Cynthia would definitely not agree to it in order to disgust Colin. And Colin didn't want Cynthia to agree. He only wanted the other party to inquire about the price. The seed of hatred had been planted, waiting to take root and germinate. Hearing Cynthia's rejection of Colin, Sar's body immediately relaxed. But just as Colin expected, Sar's resentment towards Cynthia was deeply buried. At this time, Sar suddenly remembered something his father once said, "Don't get too close to the nobles. We are cows and sheep, they are tigers and leopards. We eat grass, they eat meat, what they eat is our meat." Sar had always looked down on his father. He felt that he was too conservative, too timid, and didn't have enough initiative and adventurous spirit. But Sar agreed with the above words. These nobles had never treated the commoners as the same kind of creatures, and had never cared about their lives. However, Sar didn't completely agree with his father's words. In Sar's opinion, he wasn't destined to eat grass for the rest of his life. He also wanted to eat meat. Eat the nobles' meat. Colin didn't expect that what he had buried in Sar's heart was not only the resentment towards Cynthia, but also the resentment towards the entire noble class. This resentment was slowly accumulating bit by bit, and one day, it would become a frenzy that would sweep across the entire northern frontier. After Cynthia left with Sar, Colin waited for a long time before Vera finally arrived. It couldn't be helped. Women always changed their clothes very slowly. Moreover, the speed was usually inversely proportional to the beauty of the clothes. Of course, when Colin saw Vera after changing her clothes, he still felt that it was worth it no matter how long he had to wait. He saw that she had changed into a purple chiffon shirt with a white military uniform on the outside. Her tight breeches outlined a pair of round and straight legs, firmly attracting the attention of a certain LSP. Vera seemed to have noticed Colin's gaze, and her small face blushed a little. "Let's go, Colin." "Okay." The three of them got on their horses and went all the way to the outskirts of the city. The spring morning was bright and sunny. Even though Colin hated direct sunlight because of his bloodline, he had to admit that it was a beautiful morning. It was suitable for a spring outing. Unfortunately, the atmosphere was not right. The current tense situation made Colin and Vera not in the mood to talk, and they were only focused on galloping all the way. Under the guidance of the Marquis bodyguard, the three of them gradually approached the Black Cavalry's camp outside the city. Facing the strong murderous aura, Colin didn't even have the time to peek at Vera's vigorous figure as she rode the horse. The situation seemed to be wrong. Wasn't it just a hunt? Why was there such a murderous aura? Colin frowned as he tried to think of a way to persuade Marquis Garcia later. To be honest, he was not very confident. In his opinion, since that night when Marquis Garcia forced Marquis Charles to give up his title in public, there was no room for negotiation. To be honest, Colin always felt that Marquis Garcia was not very smart in dealing with this matter. First, he pushed out Consudwa to attract the firepower, and then in the name of smoothing things over, he was actually trying to get Marquis Garcia involved. He achieved his goal without leaving a trace, but he did not let himself get too involved in this whirlpool. The whole operation was very smooth, and he could advance and retreat freely. This was the quality and means that an old politician should have. and Marquis Garcia. This person, who was the best in the northern frontier in terms of military talent, seemed to be a little naive. Just as Colin was thinking, the three of them arrived at the center of the Black Cavalry's camp and saw Marquis Garcia. "Uncle." Marquis Garcia nodded to the two of them, as if he was not surprised by their arrival. "Uncle, where are you going to hunt?" Vera looked at the Black Cavalry's army that was ready to go, and her heart was beating fast. At this time, Colin's mood had already sunk to the bottom. Although he had not started to persuade him, looking at the Black Cavalry, there was no way he could persuade him. They were ready to fight. In Colin's desperate eyes, Marquis Garcia raised his horsewhip and pointed to the north. "Sky Ice Field." "Sky Ice Field?" Marquis Garcia smiled and said affirmatively, "I am going to hunt in the Sky Ice Field." Vera was still in a daze, but Colin had already reacted. They had been deceived. The entire northern frontier had been deceived. No, not only the northern frontier, even the trolls had been deceived. Marquis Garcia deliberately created a tense situation with the Duke of St. Hilda in order to confuse the enemy. He wanted everyone to think that the Black Cavalry was going to cause civil strife in the northern frontier. However, from the beginning to the end, Marquis Garcia's goal was only one: the trolls. Colin thought that he had just criticized Marquis Garcia's political incompetence, but now it seemed that the other party was simply acting. He had been deceived from the beginning to the end like a fool. "Knight Colin." Marquis Garcia suddenly turned to Colin. "Someone told me that you were born to be on the battlefield. Do you dare to hunt in the Sky Ice Field with me?" Colin only felt blood rushing to his head, and the figure of Marquis Garcia became so tall in his eyes. He was indeed the god of war in the northern frontier. He was indeed the guardian of the human race. He was indeed the idol of all the young people in the northern frontier. How could such a person get caught up in the whirlpool of internal strife and deceit? His journey would always be the same: the Sky Ice Field. Thinking of this, Colin replied loudly, "Why wouldn't I dare?" Marquis Garcia laughed heartily as he waved his long whip and gave an order. "Go!" The 50,000 cavalrymen were like a black tide that covered the sky and the earth, rolling towards the north. Chapter 45. Colin originally thought that the northern frontier of the Radiant Empire was cold enough. But now he realized that compared to the Sky Ice Plains, the northern frontier was like a giant greenhouse. It was almost the end of May. If it was the northern frontier, it would already feel like summer. But in the Sky Ice Plains, it was actually snowing. No wonder the northern frontier didn't continue to expand their territory to the north even when they had the absolute advantage. The people of the northern frontier really didn't want to come to such a bitter and cold place. Amidst the howling northern wind, the swirling snow quickly dyed the world white. The 50,000 Black Cavalry were like a surging black tide, galloping north in the snow. The hooves of the horses trampled on the ground, shattering the snow and turning up the cold, hard soil. The rumbling of the horses' hooves mixed with the clashing of armor, accompanied by the whistling of the wind, created a strong and murderous melody. It had been more than half a month since they left Icestone City, but they hadn't encountered a single troll army along the way. This wasn't strange. When the troll army had started to retreat, the Black Cavalry had been slow in their pursuit. Plus, they had been delayed in Icestone City for so long that the troll army had retreated a long time ago. However, the troll army had reaped a great harvest from the northern frontier this time. They definitely wouldn't be able to leave quickly with the loot they had plundered. Based on the speed of the Black Cavalry pursuit, Colin estimated that they would be able to catch up to the troll army's tail in a few days if they didn't chase in the wrong direction. Marquis Garcia seemed to have realized this as well. In the past few days, the number of scouts he had sent out had increased significantly. But the Sky Ice Plains was still too big. The troll army of 300,000 seemed like a lot, but when thrown into this vast ice plains, it was like a drop in the ocean. Plus, in this kind of wind and snow, the tracks left behind by the army would be quickly buried. It was basically a fool's dream to try to track them down. Therefore, the first difficulty of this pursuit was to find the troll army's tracks in the vast ice plains. This required one to be extremely familiar with the geography of the ice plains and be very clear about the possible retreat routes of the troll army. In any case, Colin was completely at a loss. He had never been so deep into the sky ice plains, so he knew almost nothing about this place. Luckily, he had a powerful backer by his side, Marquis Garcia. This was the true Ice Plains war god. Yes, this title was given to him by the troll army. To be able to make the enemy give him such a title was enough to prove how terrifying Marquis Garcia was on the battlefield. With such an awesome person by his side, Colin certainly wouldn't waste such a great opportunity. Upholding the principle of asking questions whenever he did not understand, Colin would approach Marquis Garcia from time to time and ask questions. And Marquis Garcia, with such patience, not to mention Colin, even some of the high-ranking generals in the Black Guards were envious. Garcia. Does Uncle have a lover? Vera hid her small face deep inside the fox fur shawl and only a pair of puzzled big eyes could be seen. Yes. Colin had a gossipy look on his face. I know that the Marquis has never married, but does he not have a lover? Yes, the black cavalry officers were always looking at him strangely. Colin was starting to doubt his origins. Oh. Vera shook her head. As far as I know, my uncle has never been overly affectionate with any woman. Furthermore, I've never heard of any related rumors in all these years. Feels like Uncle is an ascetic. All right. Colin was a little disappointed. Originally, he thought that since he was the protagonist of this world, it was normal for him to have a bizarre background. He had an awesome person like Marquis Garcia as his father and an awesome elven princess as his mother. If his grandfather, whom he had never met, suddenly passed away and left him with a country to inherit, cough cough, the howling cold wind poured into Colin's mouth, interrupting his daydream. At this moment, he suddenly realized that Marquis Garcia had no children. Moreover, if what Vera said was true and this Marquis lived like an ascetic, then he probably wouldn't have any children in the future. Then, who should inherit his title and territory? Could it be that he wanted to find an adopted child? This was a possibility. However, there was another possibility. Colin suddenly realized that he might have guessed the basis of the trust between Marquis Garcia and the Duke of St. Hilda. Previously, he had been very puzzled. Why did these two brothers dare to put on such a show? One had to know that under that situation, everyone thought that the two brothers were really going to fight. But who would have thought that it was actually a feint in the end? It was hard to believe that this kind of tacit understanding and trust would appear between these two brothers. This was because if Marquis Garcia really wanted to change the ruler of the northern frontier, he would not have led the Black Cavalry into the Sky Icefield. At that time, the Golden Lion Legion had suffered heavy losses and the lords of the northern frontier were dissatisfied with the Duke of St. Hilda because of Marquis Charles's mistakes in command. When they were in Icestone City, Marquis Garcia could have easily taken down Frostwinter City if he had led his army south. He had the ability to do so. Of course, the Duke of St. Hilda knew that his brother had the ability to do so. So, was he not afraid that his brother would make a false promise? Unless Marquis Garcia had given him some kind of promise. Of course, this promise was definitely not a verbal one. It was a substantial promise that could not be broken. Perhaps Marquis Garcia had promised his brother to have no descendants. If there were no descendants to inherit the title, what was there to fight for? This, perhaps, was the basis of their mutual trust. Just as Colin was letting his imagination run wild, a scout suddenly sent back a message. They had discovered traces of the troll army ahead. They had finally caught up. Colin could clearly feel that the soldiers were instantly excited. These soldiers who had trekked thousands of miles in the wind and snow did not have the slightest bit of slack or cower. They only had a monstrous will to fight. This was the strongest army in the northern frontier, the Black Cavalry. However, Marquis Garcia's military order came, ordering the entire army to stop advancing and set up camp on the spot. This was normal. After all, it was impossible to rush forward as soon as they discovered traces of the enemy. That was not marching to war, that was called recklessness. A calm general would understand the situation of the enemy in detail before making further decisions. Colin followed Marquis Garcia for a few kilometers and came to the place where the scouts had discovered traces of the enemy. He carefully looked at the faint traces on the snow and judged, it seems that this should be the main force of the troll army, and it was only a day or two ago. Over this period of time, Colin had been influenced by what he saw and humbly asked for guidance. He had already mastered many tracking skills in the icy plains. Marquis Garcia nodded and agreed with Colin's judgment. He then asked, "Then, do you think we should continue chasing?" "Why not?" Colin was somewhat puzzled. Wasn't this the reason they had trekked thousands of miles in the cold? But Marquis Garcia shook his head. This is not our goal. Chapter 46. When night fell, the snow finally stopped. But this didn't mean that the most difficult time had passed. In fact, it wasn't cold when it was snowing, but it was truly frightening after the snow. Under the orders of Marquis Garcia, the Black Cavalry set up camp and started a bonfire. If they didn't warm themselves up and eat something warm, this army would probably suffer non-combat casualties. Colin didn't squeeze into the tent, but instead huddled under the belly of the warhorse and warmed himself up by the fire. In fact, the inside of the tent wasn't much warmer than under the belly of the horse, and it was more comfortable to be alone. At least, no one would notice that he was drinking blood. The blood was fox blood, which he had saved from an unlucky snow fox he had caught. Of course, when Colin drank the blood, he also took out some hard jerky and took a few bites, so that no one would notice that he didn't eat normal food. As he ate and drank, he thought about what Marquis Garcia had said. At that time, Colin didn't really understand, but the Marquis didn't explain in detail. Colin didn't pursue the matter. After all, he couldn't ask about everything. That would make his students seem silly. That's right, at this moment, Colin already considered himself as Marquis Garcia's student. Just as he was thinking about Marquis Garcia's true intentions, a figure came over. "Do you want some wine?" With the help of the fire, Colin saw who it was. It was Count Farron Dawson. Of course. Colin took the wine bag from Count Dawson's hand and took a big gulp. With one gulp, it was as if there was a fire burning from his throat to his stomach. That taste made him feel energetic. Refreshing. Good wine. Count Dawson laughed loudly and said proudly, "Of course, we dwarves don't dare to say that our wine is the best in the empire, but it's definitely the most powerful. It's especially suitable to drink in this damned weather." Compared to the 5 major races in this world, the dwarves weren't considered a big power. They were scattered all over the Radiant Empire, and their total number was about 1 million. Because they weren't strong, the dwarves had always been hugging the thighs of the humans and considered themselves as a vassal race. There were even some rumors that dwarves were actually a subspecies of humans. However, this statement did not receive much approval. This was because dwarves could not be baptized by the church's priests and become knights like humans. Moreover, knight was the exclusive profession of the human race. Although the dwarves had always claimed to believe in the god of light in order to better integrate into the human race, it was clear that the god of light did not bestow his glory upon the dwarves. As a result, the common warrior class became the only choice for the dwarves. This profession, which was naturally limited in potential, made it impossible for the dwarves to produce real powerhouses. Therefore, this was not a race known for their strength. However, they were good at forging and brewing wine. Especially forging, this skill made the dwarves very popular in the logistics department of the army. However, the military merits of the logistics department were definitely not comparable to those of the soldiers who fought on the front lines. Therefore, very few dwarves could rely on military merits to become nobles. Not to mention a great noble like the Count. Thus, this Count Dawson was particularly eye-catching. More importantly, his title was conferred by Marquis Garcia. Marquis Garcia's foundation was in the Black Cavalry, and his vassals were all high-ranking generals in the army. However, he had conferred the title of Count to a dwarf. Moreover, this was the only count he had conferred. This was very unusual. The Black Cavalry was a pure cavalry army, and the dwarves' height limited their possibility of becoming outstanding cavalry. Moreover, according to Colin's understanding, although Count Dawson was a warrior, his rank was not high. Therefore, Count Dawson's military merits did not depend on his strength. In the Black Cavalry, Count Dawson seemed to be Marquis Garcia's shadow. Marquis Garcia was the soul of this army and the flag on the surface. Count Dawson, on the other hand, was the manager behind the scenes, maintaining the logistical support of this army as well as the tedious daily affairs. Although Count Dawson's work was mostly unknown, he was able to be conferred the title of Count by Marquis Garcia. From this, one could see how important he was to the Black Cavalry. Thus, after Colin entered the Black Cavalry, apart from Marquis Garcia, the person he paid the most attention to was Count Dawson. Because Marquis Garcia looked at Colin in a different light, Count Dawson, who was the Marquis shadow, was also very friendly towards Colin. Thus, the two gradually became familiar with each other. At this moment, Colin and Earl Dawson were curled up under the belly of the horse, each of them drinking wine and chatting about everything under the sun. Count Dawson had followed Marquis Garcia for half of his life and had experienced all kinds of storms. He had always been successful in bragging. But he did not expect that this time, Colin would steal the limelight. Colin told Earl Dawson all kinds of myths and legends from the other world in a completely different way, scaring the dwarf Earl to no end. When Count Dawson asked him where he had read these stories, Colin said that he had heard them from a bard who had passed by Grey Castle Town when he was a child. Count Dawson obviously could not verify this, so he could only continue to listen to Colin's lies. After a round of bragging, Colin felt much better. Now I understand why Marquis Garcia values you so much. Because you can brag. Colin laughed heartily. He obviously knew that the other party was joking. However, his expression changed as he asked, Count Dawson, do you really think that Marquis Garcia values me because of this? Seeing Colin's serious expression, Count Dawson knew that he was asking sincerely. Thus, he stopped joking and asked, why do you think? Colin drank a mouthful of wine and thought for a moment before he said, it is either because of the battle at the Rapids River or because of Miss Vera. I don't think these two reasons are enough for Marquis Garcia to take care of me like this, right? Indeed. The Angeli family was the vassal of the Duke of St. Hilda, so Colin was simply an outsider to the Black Cavalry, who was completely under Marquis Garcia's system. No matter how outstanding Colin's war talent was during his escape, and no matter how good Miss Vera's impression of him was, it was not enough for Marquis Garcia, who was the god of war on the northern frontier, to take care of an outsider like him. Hearing this, Count Dawson nodded. Then, he shook his head and said mysteriously, Hee. You will know in the future. Colin was depressed. This kind of answer that left him hanging was the most annoying. Before he could continue to ask, Count Dawson had already stiffly changed the topic. Do you know why Marquis Garcia did not continue to pursue the troll army in front? In fact, this was the question that Colin had been thinking about. And he already had some ideas. At this time, when he heard Count Dawson's question, he replied, I think that the troll army in front should not be our priority target. Then what is it? The wolf cavalry. Colin exhaled a breath of wine and said confidently, in this flat and wide terrain, only cavalry can deal with cavalry. Therefore, the troll wolf cavalry is the only threat to the Black Cavalry. As long as we find and eliminate them first, the rest of the troll army will be like lambs waiting to be slaughtered. Count Dawson clapped his hands and praised with a smile, Knight Bliss is right. Knight Bliss is right. You are indeed born for the battlefield. Chapter 47. In the next few days, the Black Cavalry's movements confirmed Colin's conjecture. Under the command of Marquis Garcia, they carefully maintained a certain distance from the main troll army while continuously searching for traces of the wolf cavalry. Since the main troll army was here, then the wolf cavalry must be nearby as well. Right now, the Black Cavalry's most important mission was to discover them before they discovered him. Finally, on the third day, the Black Cavalry discovered traces of the Wolf Cavalry's main force. The situation at the time was actually quite dangerous. Because when the Black Cavalry scouts discovered the Wolf Cavalry's tracks, the two armies were only 15 kilometers apart. This was an extremely dangerous distance for a cavalry army. If it was a normal battle, then this should be the edge of the scouts' detection range. It could be said that the two sides had practically brushed past each other. It was no wonder that the wolf cavalry was careless and didn't discover the black cavalry who was so close. Because they didn't even realize that there was a pursuing army behind them. This was the reason why Marquis Garcia had purposely put on a show earlier. The trolls were completely paralyzed. In their eyes, the black cavalry should still be in Ice Stone City right now and might have already started fighting with the Duke of St. Hilda's Golden Lion army. Even if the trolls really did have spies in Ice Stone City, they wouldn't be able to send the black cavalry's movements to the troll army in time. Because the fastest method of communication in this world was carrier pigeons. However, carrier pigeons could only find their way home based on magnetic field changes, so they could only be used to send messages to a fixed location. The troll army that was on the move definitely wouldn't be able to receive the carrier pigeons. The second fastest method of communication was the human flesh delivery on horseback. However, the black cavalry himself was a cavalry, so his speed wouldn't be slower than a messenger on horseback. Not to mention, they would also pay attention to the situation behind them and wouldn't let a messenger pass by so easily. Thus, Marquis Garcia had actually made use of the time difference in obtaining information to put on a show with his brother, and then relied on the amazing mobility of the black cavalry to catch the trolls off guard. However, even though the enemy was right in front of him and was defenseless, Marquis Garcia did not immediately launch an attack. Instead, he ordered the army to follow the path taken by the wolf cavalry and chase after them. As an excellent general, patience was one of the basic qualities that one must have. After that, the two sides maintained a distance of 30 to 40 miles until night fell. The wolf cavalry stopped setting up camp to rest, and the black cavalry also stopped advancing at the same time. The north wind whistled, and snow began to fall. This made it easier for the black cavalry to hide their tracks. That night, no fire was allowed in the black cavalry's camp. Without a bonfire, Colin was finally unable to withstand the cold wind outside and entered Count Dawson's tent. Count Dawson was very enthusiastic, and he once again took out a bottle of liquor and chatted with Colin as they drank. Perhaps it was because the enemy was right in front of them, but the atmosphere in the camp was a little tense and anxious. Of course, this did not mean that the soldiers of the black cavalry were afraid. This kind of tension was a natural reaction, and it meant that the soldiers were already vigilant. On the other hand, their impatience represented their impatience to start a massacre. Such a victorious army had completely eliminated the fear of battle from their bodies. Count Dawson and Colin did not talk for too long that night. They also knew that the battle was imminent, and in order to preserve their energy, they went to bed early. Although it was the Count's tent, there were still 7 or 8 people squeezed inside. These were all the Count's squires. In order to maintain mobility, the black cavalry would definitely bring as few tents as possible. Even the Count could only squeeze with his squires for the time being. In the entire army, only Marquis Garcia and Miss Vera were qualified to have their own tents. Colin did not dare to squeeze into their tents. Although he really wanted to squeeze into the latter's tent. In fact, Count Dawson's tent was already very big. Those ordinary soldiers' tents could even squeeze 20 to 30 men. With so many men squeezed into one tent, it was inevitable that the smell would be a little pungent, and the sound of snoring would come one after another. However, Colin, who had been trekking for an entire day and was almost freezing, did not care about these things. He almost fell asleep immediately. However, before he could sleep enough, he was woken up by Count Dawson. "What's the matter?" When Colin woke up, he realized that it was only past midnight. He was a little upset. Marquis's military order. In 1 hourglass, the entire army will set off. When he heard that it was the Marquis's military order, Colin, who was still a little upset, could only get up obediently. In the other tents, the sound of the officers waking up the soldiers could be heard. However, these officers were not as gentle as they used their feet to wake up the soldiers. "Bastard! Why are you sleeping so soundly? I have already squeezed into your tent for so long and you didn't even notice me. Where is your alertness? Ah, don't kick, don't kick. I will get up now." After a short period of chaos, The black cavalry quickly gathered and followed the trail of the wolf cavalry. "Are you preparing for a night attack?" Colin moved to Count Dawson's side and asked softly. "Night attack?" Count Dawson looked at Colin with a strange look in his eyes. He then realized that the other party was still young and did not have much experience in leading troops. Therefore, he patiently explained the situation to Colin. After listening to Count Dawson's explanation, Colin finally realized that he had been deceived by those unscrupulous novels. Don't look at the plot of attacking a camp in the middle of the night in novels. In reality, very few generals dared to do so. Even if there was really a night attack, it would generally be a small-scale attack. A large army would never fight at night. The reason was simple: the risk of fighting at night was too great. Borrowing the darkness of the night could indeed catch the enemy off guard, but it was also very easy for one's own side to fall into chaos due to improper military orders. If one was not careful, both sides would suffer. For cavalry, a night battle was even more impossible. This was because the darkness of the night restricted the warhorses even more. Let's talk about the terrain. Although the Sky Ice Plains was a large plain with flat terrain, it was a flat terrain. No matter how flat the terrain was, it was inevitable that there would be some ups and downs, and there would be many potholes. These small ditches were not a problem during the day, and the warhorses could easily gallop through them. However, at night they were extremely dangerous. If one was not careful and the horse's hooves were to be injured, then the joke would be huge. Therefore, for a cavalry army, it was still possible to hold torches or use the moonlight to slowly march. However, if they wanted to charge into battle, then their brains would be muddled. Marquis Garcia naturally would not make such a low-level mistake. Therefore, at this moment, his orders were only for the black cavalry to use the darkness of the night to carefully approach the wolf cavalry camp, and not to attack in the darkness. It was no wonder that Colin did not understand this. Although he had followed his father Baron Angeli to the battlefield, the Angeli family's army did not have organized cavalry. Cavalry was an expensive troop type, and normal nobles could not afford to raise them. Therefore, he knew very little about cavalry warfare. Under the bright moonlight, the black cavalry approached the enemy step by step. The spare horses and supplies were left in place, and the hooves of the warhorses were also wrapped in cloth. The whole process of the march was not completely silent, but it could definitely be considered secretive and quiet. It was as if he was an experienced hunter quietly approaching his prey. The moment the prey noticed, perhaps the arrow would have already been shot in front of him. After an unknown amount of time, Colin finally saw the dots of light in the distance. It was the bonfire of the troll camp that had not been extinguished. Colin took a deep breath and held the long sword in his hand tightly. At this moment, the Marquis military order came again. All troops, rest and reorganize. At this moment, it was the darkest time before dawn. The whole black cavalry was completely hidden in the darkness, quietly waiting for the moment when the sun rose. The moment when the slaughter began. Chapter 48. When the first ray of sunlight shone on the ice plains, the snow suddenly stopped. Colin, who was dozing off, felt someone nudging him. "What's the matter? Are we going to fight?" Colin instantly woke up. Yes. Count Dawson, who was beside him, had a resolute expression as he looked forward. At the same time, the messenger ran back and forth in the army formation, passing on the Marquis orders. "Everyone, get on your horses and prepare for battle." Following this order, the black cavalry gradually woke up. The soldiers began to check their armor, horse gear, and weapons. Then, under the urging of the officer, they got on their horses and got into formation. As the sky gradually brightened, rows of cavalry in black armor were already neatly arranged on the ice plains. The aura of slaughter began to spread in the army formation. Faint traces of blood slowly appeared in each and every pair of eyes. All the exhaustion and coldness disappeared without a trace at this moment. All that was left was surging hot blood and unconcealable tyranny. Colin, who was in the middle of it, could not help but be infected by this atmosphere. His breathing gradually became heavy, and his rationality gradually faded. A primitive and bloody impulse that was rooted in the blood of all living creatures began to flourish. At this moment, he suddenly understood what a real army of tigers and wolves was, an invincible army. On the other hand, the troll camp was still as quiet as before. They simply did not know that the scythe of the Grim Reaper had quietly descended and was almost at their necks. Among the blackguards, everyone's gaze turned to where the black lion flag was. They looked at the figure of the man under the flag. Like countless times in the past, there was no stirring speech before the battle. Marquis Garcia slowly pulled out the sword at his waist, raised it high above his head, and pointed it forward abruptly. In an instant, the low sound of a bugle horn sounded. Woo! The army began to surge forward. First, they slowly jogged, then gradually increased their speed. Finally, at a suitable distance, they entered the state of galloping and charging. As the most elite cavalry in the northern frontier, the Black Cavalry could be said to be the Black Cavalry's most elite cavalry. This kind of battle rhythm was completely integrated into the blood of every Black Cavalry soldier. They did not even need to be commanded by their generals. The rumbling of horse hooves reverberated across the icy plains, finally becoming the only sound in the world. At this time, the giant demon was finally alarmed. However, most of the trolls hadn't even woken up from their slumber. Even if they had woken up, they hadn't had time to eat breakfast, let alone weapons and armor. Countless trolls ran out of their tents in a panic, shouting and asking their equally confused companions what had happened. The commander of the Wolf Cavalry, General Quake, also woke up from his dream and immediately realized that something was wrong. Just as he raised his saber and rushed out of the tent, he saw a guard rush over with a panicked expression. "General, it's not good. The enemy is coming." Quake kicked the guard over, then jumped onto the back of his wolf mount and looked in the direction of the sound. Then, his eyes instantly widened to the extreme, as if they were about to split open. Because he realized that cavalry, a lot of cavalry, were charging towards them. Quake's first reaction was that it was impossible. He had led troops in battle for so many years, but he had never let so many cavalrymen get so close to him before he realized it. Such a strange thing almost subverted his understanding of the world. But in the next moment, Quake threw all of his inconceivable thoughts aside. Because he had already seen the black lion flag fluttering in the wind. Black cavalry! In an instant, all the blood in Quake's body froze. He suddenly calmed down. It was as if at this moment, the leader of the Wolf Cavalry had foreseen his inescapable fate. The light in his eyes completely disappeared, leaving only a deep, deathly stillness. Quake immediately grabbed a guard by the collar and roared in a low voice. "Immediately lead a team of Wolf Cavalry and run southwest. Run all the way, don't look back. No matter what, you have to inform His Highness Prince Gamber that Black Cavalry is coming." Then General, the guard was still hesitating, but Quake had already pushed him far away. "Get out of here, get out of here." After that, Quake pulled out his scimitar and rushed in the direction of the black guards without hesitation. The desolate sound of a horn finally rang out from the troll camp. As the most elite warriors of the troll race, these wolf cavalry were caught off guard, but under Quake's leadership, they quickly organized themselves and prepared for the upcoming battle. But it was still too late. The Wolf Cavalry didn't even have time to speed up before they discovered that Black Cavalry's vanguard had already crossed the short distance and rushed in front of them. The human cavalry, full of murderous intent, raised their sabers at an angle. Under the morning sun, they looked like a surging silver wave. Then, this surging wave instantly rushed into the troll camp, bringing with it a spray of blood and flying limbs. Quake roared at the top of his lungs, trying to maintain the loose formation and not let it be completely destroyed. At the same time, he gathered a group of wolf cavalry and turned around to run away from black cavalry. This wasn't an escape. The moment he saw the black lion flag, Quake was prepared to die in battle. Quake didn't feel humiliated to die at the hands of Marquis Garcia. Instead, he felt honored. But he still had some regrets. Because he felt that he wasn't ready. Even if he lost, he still hoped to make the most powerful attack and let Marquis Garcia know how powerful he was. He understood that the most important thing in a cavalry battle was speed. And speed required distance. So, he planned to lead his troops in the opposite direction. After a certain distance, he would wait for an opportunity to counterattack. This was indeed the wisest move. But unfortunately, black cavalry wouldn't give him this opportunity. In this battle, the troll-wolf cavalry was destined to be extremely aggrieved. They actually had more people than the black cavalry, but they had already lost the initiative. The flag in Quake's hand and the conspicuous armor on his body were quickly targeted by the black cavalry. Quake's running speed wasn't slow, but in front of the black cavalry who had already entered a state of rapid charge, he was still frighteningly slow. A team of black cavalry arrived in the blink of an eye and surrounded Quake. The surging saber light whistled. There was no such thing as a fair duel. This was a battlefield of life and death, and there was no room for chivalry here. As a 5th-grade warrior, Quake could be considered a famous expert among the trolls. But no matter how powerful an expert was, he couldn't withstand the siege of an army. What's more, there were many high-level knights among the black cavalry. After creating a terrifying record of killing hundreds of people, the leader of the wolf cavalry was finally beheaded by a human knight. With Quake's flag broken, the troll-wolf cavalry completely collapsed. The black cavalry passed through the field, leaving behind a ground full of corpses and flowing blood. This was a complete massacre. Chapter 49. The setting sun was as red as blood. The slaughter that had lasted for an entire day finally subsided. This Wolf Rider camp had become a graveyard in the truest sense of the word. Dense black dots hovered in the sky. They were vultures that had been attracted by the smell of blood. Wherever there was death, there would be their shadows. Of course, the black cavalry also had casualties. However, the corpses of these soldiers could not be left in the wild to be ravaged by wild beasts like the trolls. Instead, they were gathered together and burned. When he saw the corpse of a high-ranking knight being consumed by fire, Colin's heart ached. What a waste! However, no matter how much Colin drooled, he did not dare to desecrate the corpse of his fellow soldiers in front of the black cavalry. Unwilling to give up, he even went to find Count Dawson and requested to bury these dead soldiers. Count Dawson rolled his eyes and said, "Why don't you try digging a hole in this ice field?" Colin really did try. He was half dead from exhaustion. The frozen ground here was too hard to dig. No wonder the black cavalry chose to cremate them. Helpless, Colin could not continue to pester him and could only give up. After cleaning up the battlefield, the results of this battle were estimated. The trolls had left over 30,000 corpses here. Of course, there were even more wolf cavalry that had fled in the chaos. Therefore, the battle was not over yet. What followed was a bloody and cruel pursuit. The trolls' commander's tent had now become the black cavalry's temporary command post. Marquis Garcia expressionlessly gave out battle orders. Under his command, the black cavalry was like a precise mechanical octopus. It stretched out its tentacles and tightly wrapped around the wolf cavalry that were trying to escape until they were all strangled to death. Colin hid in a corner, carefully observing and learning. This was a rare opportunity. Although he did not understand why Marquis Garcia would allow him, an outsider who did not belong to the black cavalry, to observe and learn without restraint, Colin did not feel embarrassed. Not everyone had the opportunity to learn the art of war from the world's most outstanding general. Finally, the military order was issued. The black cavalry officers walked out of their tents in silence. There were no questions or objections. This army was used to obeying Marquis Garcia's orders. Because as long as they were absolutely obedient, they could win one victory after another. It worked every time. This was how prestige was built. When a commander could lead his men to victory after victory, he would be a god in the hearts of his soldiers. In fact, this was the reason why famous generals were always suspected by monarchs. In a special group like the army, everything was based on victory. Even if he was a monarch in name, if he could not lead his soldiers to victory, then his orders would not be carried out. The reason was very simple. These soldiers did not understand politics, nor did they understand loyalty. However, they understood a simple principle: people would die if they lost a battle. Moreover, It was very likely that he would be the one dying. Therefore, in order to survive, they had to win. If they could win the rebellion, they would not hesitate to follow their commander and rebel. Colin adjusted his armor and stretched his muscles. Of course, he did not receive any military orders. After all, he was an outsider. In addition to him, there was actually another outsider here, Vera. The female mage was already dozing off. Her head was nodding off, and she looked very cute. However, it was not her fault. After all, she was woken up in the middle of the night last night. Today, she had been fighting for the whole day. She did not understand much of the military meeting just now. Therefore, it was inevitable that she would start to doze off. Hey, wake up! Colin leaned over and nudged Vera with his elbow. What's wrong? Vera raised her head in confusion. When she saw Colin's mischievous smile, she suddenly blushed. Marquis Garcia was still discussing something with Count Dawson in a low voice. It seemed that he did not notice the small movements of the two outsiders. Is this battle over? Vera glanced at her uncle. When she saw that he was not paying attention to her, she was secretly relieved. It's not completely over yet. Next, we have to chase after the defeated wolf riders. We cannot let them regroup, and we cannot let them join up with the troll army in the southwest. Vera frowned slightly, but soon the expression on her face became firm again. She did not complain at all. To be honest, this adopted daughter of the Duke was indeed very determined. She was not spoiled at all. The physical body of a mage was weak, but she still insisted on not falling behind. It was indeed commendable. Marquis Garcia looked at her and said softly, "Later, you will follow Count Dawson and stay behind to clean up the battlefield. I will lead the army and continue to chase after them." Vera understood that her uncle was being considerate of her. Therefore, she obediently agreed. After that, Marquis Garcia looked at Colin and said, "Knight Colin, do you want to follow me or Count Dawson?" Colin immediately straightened his chest and said, "I am willing to follow you." Although it would be safer for him to stay behind, and he could also cultivate a relationship with Vera, Colin knew what was important and what was important. How could he give up such a good opportunity to learn? At this time, Marquis Garcia was more attractive than Vera. Marquis Garcia nodded and strode out of the tent. Colin quickly followed behind him. Even though the Black Guards had set up an inescapable net to prevent the remnants of the Wolf Riders from joining the main troll army, it was impossible for no one to escape on this icy plain that stretched in all directions. Most of the remaining Wolf Riders were purposely driven away in the opposite direction by the Black Knights. However, there were still a few Wolf Riders that managed to break through the Black Knights' encirclement and regroup with the main troll army. Therefore, the news of the defeat finally reached here. In the commander's tent, the atmosphere was oppressive and dignified. The tall troll sitting on the main seat looked a little absent-minded at this time. His name was Gombik Woken. He was the southern prince of the Troll Empire. The trolls' ruling system was very similar to that of humans. In fact, this was the result of their efforts to learn and imitate the Empire of Light after being repeatedly defeated. The highest ruler was the Troll Emperor, Modolf Woken. Under him were the four princes of the East, South, West, and North. Their status was similar to the Duke of the four territories of the Empire of Light. Among the four princes, the Southern Prince was the most powerful in terms of prestige and strength. The reason was very simple. The southern part of the Troll Empire was the northern frontier. This direction was not only the greatest threat to the Troll Empire, but also their ancestral land. Guarding the southern part of the sky ice field, if one did not have a certain level of strength, he would have already been killed. Therefore, generally, when fighting against the northern frontier, unless the Troll Emperor personally led the army, the southern prince would be the supreme commander. This time was of course no exception. Gombik Woken, the number 2 figure of the Troll Empire, could be considered an old acquaintance of Marquis Garcia. The two of them had fought for more than 10 years, and Gombik had never won. But even so, his reputation in the Troll Empire was growing day by day. The reason for such a strange situation was that although Gombik had always lost, he had lost the most beautifully. Sometimes, he could even exchange blows with Marquis Garcia. As for the other generals of the Troll Empire, as long as they met the Black Cavalry, they would lose without exception. Therefore, Gambik Woken became the only troll general who could contend against Marquis Garcia. In this southern expedition, Gambik took advantage of the fact that Marquis Garcia was transferred away from the front lines and used victory after victory to announce to the world it was not that Gambik was incapable, but that Marquis Garcia was too abnormal. If you don't believe me, take a look. Once Marquis Garcia is no longer around, no one in the northern region will be his match. But he did not expect that Marquis Garcia would actually return. Moreover, he had used such a quiet method to deal him such a ruthless blow. Gambik stared blankly for a long time before finally opening his mouth. His hoarse voice echoed in the commander's tent, "Everyone, what should we do now?" However, the troll generals in the tent looked at each other in silence. The entire tent was deathly silent. Chapter 50. The midday sun shone on the icy plains, bringing some warmth. However, all the troll soldiers felt was a bone-chilling cold. No one knew when it started, but squads of black cavalry scouts appeared around the army. They looked at them from afar as if they were staring at their prey. Compared to the 200,000 troll army, the black cavalry scouts were like ants beside an elephant's foot. They were weak and insignificant, as if the elephant could casually stomp them to death. However, the ones who were truly nervous were the troll army, this bloated elephant. The 200,000 troll army that had won the battle had inevitably spread out during the long march. In particular, the army at the back responsible for transporting the loot had long since disappeared from sight. However, when the news of the wolf cavalry's main force being attacked by the black cavalry came back, the troll army was like a school of fish that had been startled and immediately gathered together. Moreover, under the orders of Southern Prince Gambir, the 50,000 human slaves stolen from the northern frontier were directly abandoned on the icy plains. That's right, before the black cavalry main force could even be seen, the troll army had already taken the initiative to spit out what they had eaten. Prince Gambir was very clear that these human slaves would only become a burden to the army. It was better to just throw them away. As for whether or not these 50,000 human slaves would freeze to death on the ice field, that was not his concern. If the black cavalry took these 50,000 human slaves, perhaps Prince Gambir would wake up laughing in his dreams. The black cavalry scouts did indeed discover these 50,000 abandoned human slaves, but when they passed the news to Marquis Garcia, he did not hesitate at all and chose to ignore them. Cold-blooded and heartless. But this was the decisiveness of a commander. The black cavalry was traveling light and did not bring much food. If they took these human slaves, everyone would starve to death on the icy plains. At this moment, the black cavalry did not have the time to pay attention to the troll army. They were still chasing after the remnants of the defeated wolf cavalry. Marquis Garcia's strategy was very clear. He wanted to first completely annihilate the wolf cavalry and destroy the enemy's only means of resistance. Then he would slowly bleed the troll army. The pursuit of the wolf cavalry lasted for 5 days and 5 nights. According to the black cavalry's preliminary calculations, including the attack on the camp, close to 70,000 wolf cavalry had been killed. Yes, there were only kills, no prisoners. When Marquis Garcia learned that the troll army had abandoned the human slaves, he gave the order not to take any troll prisoners. At this point, the wolf cavalry had completely lost the ability to fight, and the remaining few deserters were no longer a threat. Marquis Garcia also began to gather the blackguards. After a short rest, he began to approach the location of the troll army. The final stage of this battle had officially begun. The troll army that was slowly advancing suddenly realized that the sentries of the black cavalry that had been following them around like gangrene had suddenly vanished without a trace. This made the troll soldiers feel somewhat at a loss. However, Prince Gambik immediately became nervous, because he understood that the disappearance of the sentinels could only mean one thing. The black cavalry's main force had arrived. As expected, the snow on the icy plains suddenly began to tremble, and the sound of hooves could be faintly heard. The troll soldiers looked around them and were shocked to discover that the cavalry units of the black cavalry were attacking them from all directions. Woo! The sound of a horn immediately sounded, and after a brief moment of chaos, the troll army began to get into formation to meet the enemy. However, panic still spread uncontrollably through the troll army. Even though they had the advantage in numbers, that black lion flag seemed to have some sort of soul-stirring magic. Every time it appeared in the sky above the icy plains, it would give the trolls a great sense of pressure. The black cavalry came very quickly. Accompanied by the thunderous sound of hooves, a dozen cavalry units surrounded the troll army from all directions. Each unit of black cavalry had around 1,000 people, and there were less than 20,000 in total. Compared to the 200,000 troll army, they were like ants trying to shake a tree. However, looking at the aggressive manner in which the black cavalry units surrounded them, it was as if they were the rulers of this battlefield. When they got close, the black cavalry units immediately changed directions and swept past the troll army's flank. They knocked arrows on their bows, and then the buzzing of bowstrings filled the air. The black rain of arrows was like a swarm of locusts that covered the sky, surging toward the troll army. Don't panic. Raise your shields. Raise your shields. Archers, get ready. Spearmen, get ready. Don't move. Don't retreat. Maintain formation. The sounds of military orders rang out continuously in the troll army, instantly drowning out the thunderous sound of hooves. Arrows rained down like a torrential rain, clanging against the shields. However, there were also the sounds of arrows piercing flesh. Large swathes of troll soldiers fell to the ground, their cries echoing through the army. There was no mercy, no hesitation. The black cavalry used the crudest and cruelest method to cleanly kick off the prelude to this battle. The troll army had already shrunk into a round turtle shell, and the black cavalry units were like tangents to this circle. They galloped past the troll army's flank, constantly firing arrows like a torrential rain. When the 20,000 cavalry passed by, a clear line was drawn through the troll army. It was like a wheat field blown by a gale, leaving behind countless corpses and wailing wounded. However, the troll army was not without counterattack. The archers and spearmen in the army calmed down after enduring the first wave of attacks. Under the command of their officers, they began to fire arrows and spears at the black cavalry. For a moment, arrows and spears flew back and forth in the air, constantly reaping the lives of humans and trolls. However, the black cavalry still had the absolute advantage in mobility. They spread out in the midst of the troll army's counterattack, pulling apart the distance and circling the troll army like a pack of wolves. Once they discovered an opening, they would immediately charge forward to tear it apart. Before the troll army could react and organize a defense or counterattack, they would use the advantage of their warhorses to quickly flee, not giving the troll army a chance to counterattack. This textbook cavalry harassment battle lasted for an entire morning. Only after the 10-odd black cavalry units had retreated did the trolls finally catch their breath. In truth, this attack didn't cause too many casualties to the massive troll army. However, this immense psychological pressure caused every troll to be mentally and physically exhausted. The moment the black cavalry left, they immediately set up camp, starting a fire to cook and licking their wounds. However, before they could even take an afternoon nap after eating, the trolls were shocked to discover that the black cavalry had once again appeared all around them. It was almost a repeat of the morning. The black cavalry had once again split into 10-odd cavalry units, each about 1,000 men, and charged at the troll army once more. The troll generals who were familiar with the black cavalry's organization also keenly noticed that the group of black cavalry in the afternoon was clearly not the same as the one in the morning. This was a war of attrition. Chapter 51. The northern winds howled, and snow once again fell from the sky icefield. However, no matter how heavy the snow was, it could not stop the battle from continuing. It had been 9 days since the blackguards caught up and began to attack the tortoise shell of the troll army from all directions. For 9 days, the 50,000 black cavalry were split into 3 groups, taking turns to attack the troll army. In these 9 days, the troll army had only advanced 50 kilometers. At this rate, there was no telling how long it would take for the troll army to return to their settlement in the northern half of the sky ice plains. Moreover, they had already left behind 30,000 troll corpses in this short 50 kilometers journey. Perhaps this number of casualties was not a serious blow to an army of over 200,000. However, this pressure of not being able to escape was destroying the troll army's weak nerves day by day, pushing them to the edge of a cliff. The troll army's formation also began to reveal more and more flaws under this constant attack. However, the black cavalry still did not launch an all-out attack. They were like seasoned and cruel hunters, constantly leaving small wounds on their prey, watching it bleed, struggle, and grow weaker by the day. Marquis Garcia was very patient. Colin was also very patient. In fact, Colin even hoped that the troll army could hold on for a while longer. This was because he had learned a lot about cavalry warfare from following Marquis Garcia. This was not something that could be learned from military books or novels. It was also not something that the Angeli family's military education could compare to. In Colin's memory, the family's military education was almost all about infantry warfare. There was no helping it, the Angeli family could not afford cavalry. But now, after witnessing the terrifying might of the black cavalry, Colin could not help but want to sell everything he had to create a cavalry of his own. Once this thought was born, it was deeply rooted in Colin's mind and could not be dismissed. In order to better experience cavalry warfare, Colin had personally participated in several black cavalry attacks after receiving permission from Marquis Garcia. Although he didn't have a detailed count, Colin estimated that he had killed around 30 to 40 troll soldiers. He did not care about this bit of military merit. After all, Marquis Garcia was not his master. No matter how well he performed, he would not be rewarded by Marquis Garcia. However, Colin felt that what he had learned from Marquis Garcia was actually more valuable than money, territory, or even a noble title. He didn't even understand why this Marquis was treating him so favorably. However, he would not let go of this excellent learning opportunity. Lord Marquis, can the scale of each cavalry unit be a bit larger during the assault? As a matter of fact, Colin found the right opportunity and began to ask for guidance. Marquis Garcia had long been accustomed to this. The key to determining the scale of a cavalry battle is to grasp the balance between mobility and offense. If the scale of a cavalry unit is too small, their mobility will naturally be excellent, but their offense will be weak. However, it is not always better to send a larger cavalry unit. Once the cavalry exceeds 10,000, the commander will have to be especially careful. Military orders cannot be complicated and cannot be changed too much. This is because changing military orders on the spot will cause chaos. Therefore, a cavalry unit is usually controlled at a scale of 1,000 to 3,000. Mobility and offense can be considered to be well balanced. As for the specific deployment, it will be decided on the spot based on the target of the battle, the state of the enemy, and other factors. Colin kept nodding as he listened. It was now close to noon, and the black cavalry soldiers who had gone out to attack in the morning had returned to camp one after another. However, Colin was still keenly aware that the attack in the morning had ended a little early. Originally, he did not pay too much attention to it. After all, after so many days of continuous battle, even if the black cavalry soldiers were made of iron, it was impossible not to show some signs of fatigue. However, the more and more solemn atmosphere in the camp made Colin realize something. After hurriedly stuffing some food into his mouth and drinking some blood to replenish his strength, Colin came to Marquis Garcia's tent. The guards outside the tent did not stop him. They were already very familiar with this baron's son who was valued by Marquis Garcia. "Marquis, are you preparing for the decisive battle?" Colin looked at Marquis Garcia, who was wearing his armor with the help of his squire, and immediately asked with some excitement. Marquis Garcia smiled. "Yes, it's about time." After saying that, he walked out of the tent. Colin hurriedly followed him. Outside the tent, the black cavalry soldiers had already begun their pre-battle preparations. Moreover, Colin noticed that the soldiers who had participated in the attack in the morning were also making their preparations. In addition, the 3,000 heavy cavalry soldiers who had not participated in the attack had also finally put on their armor and were ready to go. These fully armored cavalrymen were like steel monsters. Their bodies exuded a terrifying aura, as well as an extreme thirst for slaughter. They had waited for too long and were already unable to endure their thirst. In fact, there had always been a lot of controversy about the heavy cavalry because its advantages and disadvantages were equally prominent. It was expensive, cumbersome, and it was not suitable for many situations. However, these disadvantages could not cover up the heavy cavalry's greatest advantage, which was its extremely terrifying impact force. Therefore, the heavy cavalry had become the best weapon to break through the infantry formation. At this moment of the decisive battle, Marquis Garcia had finally brought out the black cavalry's ultimate weapon, the 3,000 heavy cavalry soldiers. However, while Colin was excited, he was surprised to see that Marquis Garcia had also put on his full body armor and held his lance as he walked to the front of the heavy cavalry formation. You want to personally lead the charge? Of course. Marquis Garcia's matter-of-fact appearance made Colin somewhat astonished. He really did not understand why Marquis Garcia, as the highest commander of the black cavalry, would personally take the risk. It must be known that the heavy cavalry charging at the infantry formation, under the cover of their terrifying attack power, had a terrifying casualty rate that could not be ignored. Count Dawson smiled as he said to Colin, "Every time the heavy cavalry attack, the Marquis personally leads it." Just as Colin was shocked speechless, Marquis Garcia suddenly smiled and asked, "Knight Colin, do you dare to charge with me?" "Of course." Colin replied without the slightest hesitation, "It would be my honor." "Good." Marquis Garcia laughed heartily, "Then you will be my flag bearer." Colin immediately stepped forward to receive the heavy black lion flag. The flag bearer patted Colin's chest heavily, using so much force that Colin could not help but suspect that the flag bearer was jealous of him. Woo! The hazy bugle horn sounded once more. The slaughter had begun. Chapter 52. When the horns sounded on the icy plains, the trolls immediately got into formation. After so many days of battle, the trolls had gradually gotten used to the black cavalry's harassment rhythm. After being terrified for so long, they became numb. They were numb to the point that it was as if they were dealing with an errand. At this time, the trolls who had skillfully spread out their formation and were preparing to face the enemy did not realize what was waiting for them. Looking down from above, the black cavalry's entire army was mobilized within a radius of dozens of kilometers, faintly surrounding the troll army. Prince Cambique looked at the black guards that were closing in from all directions, and he gradually realized that something was amiss. There were too many. This was not an ordinary harassment battle. However, even though Prince Cambique had realized that the black cavalry's attack was coming, he could not come up with a plan to deal with it. This was because he did not know where the black cavalry's main attack was. From the very beginning of this battle, the black cavalry's initiative was firmly grasped in their hands. The troll army looked huge, but it was actually extremely bloated. As long as they revealed a weakness under the harassment of the black cavalry's light cavalry, the heavy cavalry hidden in the shadows would attack like lightning and completely tear this weakness into a fatal wound. And this weakness was not difficult to find. After 10 days of continuous harassment, the troll army was already exhausted. Today, the black cavalry's entire army had attacked and increased the intensity of their harassment, causing the pressure on the trolls to suddenly increase. Under this huge pressure, an opportunity naturally appeared. Marquis Garcia slowly raised his arm, and the 3,000 heavy cavalry behind him began to slowly advance. Their target was the troll army's rear right flank. The biting cold killing intent was almost tangible, pervading the air above the heavy cavalry formation. The thunderous sound of horse hooves echoed on the icy plains, rejecting all other sounds. The ground began to tremble, as if a small earthquake was occurring. With such a terrifying momentum, the trolls quickly noticed something strange. However, it was too late to adjust their formation. The black cavalry's heavy cavalry began to slowly accelerate. The black lion flag in Colin's hand fluttered in the wind. Marquis Garcia lowered his mask, leveled his lance, and leaned forward slightly. The 3,000 heavy cavalry behind him also did the same in unison. 3,000 fast-moving steel monsters, each holding a 7 to 8 meter long spear, swept towards the right rear flank of the troll army like a whirlwind of death. In the face of such power, it was as if nothing could stop it. Colin had previously felt that Marquis Garcia's action of personally leading the army was somewhat reckless. After all, as the commander-in-chief of an army, it was somewhat unwise to personally take the risk. But at this moment, he was in the middle of such a terrifying cavalry. Colin had already tossed such thoughts out of his mind. He did not know what level of knight Marquis Garcia was, but even a knight who had entered the sanctuary realm would not be able to escape death if he was trapped in an army of tens of thousands of soldiers. However, Marquis Garcia was not alone. Behind him, there were 3,000 elite heavy cavalry who had pledged their lives to follow him. These 3,000 fanatical and fearless warriors, under the lead of their idol, gradually gathered into a single entity. At this moment, every single one of them seemed to have transcended the insignificance and limitations of mortals, condensing into an indestructible collective, an omnipotent god. Such a terrifying aura, even before charging to the front of the troll army, had already caused an uncontrollable panic and chaos. Raise your shields. Raise your shields. Don't move, kill anyone who moves. The troll officers roared at the top of their lungs, trying their best to maintain the formation without falling into chaos. They were very clear that in the face of such a charge, the infantry's only hope was to maintain a complete formation. If the formation was broken, it would immediately turn into a one-sided massacre. However, in the face of the fearless charge of 3,000 heavy cavalry, in the face of such a terrifying charge that did not seem to belong to the mortal world, no one could remain calm and resolute. Rumble! The thunderous sound of horse hooves seemed to become the only sound in the world. The heavy blows struck the hearts of every troll soldier, causing them to tremble in fear, causing them to want to turn tail and run without regard for anything else. Sparse arrows and spears shot out of the troll army, but when they struck the armor of the heavy cavalry, they were unable to cause any damage. Colin raised the Black Lion banner high, almost able to see the faces of the troll soldiers right in front of him. Fear and panic were written all over their faces. Boom, boom, boom. Accompanied by a series of loud bangs, the heavy cavalry in the front row had already crashed into the shield wall that was like a porcupine with their horses. Instantly, the shields broke and the spears snapped. Countless giant demon soldiers were sent flying by the terrifying impact like wooden puppets, spurting blood from their mouths. The defensive line here was like a thin piece of paper that was torn open in an instant. Countless ferocious steel monsters rushed in unscrupulously. After breaking through the formation, the heavy cavalry of the Black Cavalry was like an extremely sharp knife, ruthlessly stabbing into the right rear flank of the giant demon army and quickly advancing deeper into the formation. Everywhere they passed, there was a rain of blood, and the ground was a mess. This terrifying scene was like hell on earth. The Black Cavalry that had been roaming in the surroundings took this opportunity to swarm in, burrowing into the gap created by the heavy cavalry and beginning their massacre. At this point, there was no longer any troll general who could stop the collapse of the army. The entire scene clearly illustrated what it meant to be defeated like a landslide. In truth, while the heavy cavalry charging into the troll army was bloody and terrifying, the direct damage they caused was very limited compared to the 200,000 troll army. However, the heavy cavalry had completely destroyed the troll army's formation, causing a terrifying panic. Once this panic spread, it would lead to an irreversible collapse. The troll soldiers that had been crushed at the front lines scrambled to escape, causing an avalanche. Like dominoes, the entire army completely collapsed. The sound of horse hooves, shouts, pleas for mercy, screams. The area within 20 kilometers was completely enveloped by the sonata of war. The Black Cavalry was like a flood that had broken through a dam, killing the troll army until corpses were strewn all over the field, and blood flowed like a river. At this moment, whether it was the soldiers, generals, or even Prince Cambic, they could not change all of this. Anything that stood in the way of the Black Cavalry would be completely crushed. Prince Cambic closed his eyes, unable to bear to watch. All of this was like a nightmare. His personal guards pulled him, wanting to escort him to escape. However, Prince Cambeek did not move. Why was he running? The 300,000 troops had been reduced to ashes. Even if he escaped, he would be better off dead. Prince Cambeek broke free from the other princes, raised his sword, and got on his horse, charging in the direction of the Black Lion flag. He shouted, "Come, Garcia! My head is here!" Chapter 53. The setting sun was as red as blood. It coldly and mercilessly reflected the horrifying and bloody scene on the icy plains. When the formation of the 200,000 troll army was completely destroyed by the Black Cavalry, it meant the end of the battle. The fate of the defeated troll army was already sealed. Even if they managed to escape temporarily, they would be caught up to sooner or later. Many of the defeated troll soldiers knelt and surrendered under the blades of the cavalry. This time, the Black Cavalry actually let these surrendered soldiers go. As long as they put down their weapons, they would be spared from death. This obviously sped up the collapse of the troll army. More and more troll soldiers began to learn from their comrades and surrender to the Black Cavalry. Groups of cavalry began to disperse, chasing after the deserters and collecting the surrendered soldiers. The heavy cavalry that had dealt a fatal blow to the troll army stopped at the edge of the battlefield. Only 1,000 of the 3,000 heavy cavalry were left. More than half of them were dead or injured. They had paid a terrifying price in order to destroy the troll army. The remaining 1,000 were all covered in blood. At a glance, they looked like a group of red steel sculptures. Colin took off his helmet and let out a long sigh. This battle was awesome. It seemed like a difficult and dangerous mission, but it was completed very easily. Of course, he knew that this was actually an illusion. Looking at the casualty rate of the heavy cavalry, he knew that this battle was definitely not easy. However, the feeling of being invincible on the battlefield was as addictive as Poppy, and he couldn't stop himself even if he wanted to. The only thing that made him feel a little sluggish was that Prince Cambeek charged head-on without any regard for his life when he passed by the troll army. Colin did not know what level of warrior Prince Cambeek was, but he dared to charge at the heavy cavalry who were at their peak. The outcome? He did not even have a complete corpse. Colin looked at Marquis Garcia, who was also covered in blood, and shouted excitedly, "We won!" Marquis Garcia was not as excited as Colin. It was as if such a great victory was as common as eating and drinking to him. "Do you know why we won?" "Of course, it's all thanks to your unparalleled strategy and wise decision." Colin took the opportunity to flatter him. Of course, his flattery came from the bottom of his heart. Marquis Garcia was definitely worthy of such praise. However, the Marquis shook his head and said solemnly, "No, I rely on them." His gaze slowly swept across the battlefield, his face full of pride as he looked at the Black Cavalry soldiers who were still galloping on the battlefield, chasing down the remnants of the troll army. Colin also put away the smile on his face. He seemed to understand Marquis Garcia's meaning. Marquis Garcia retracted his gaze and looked at Colin again. Tactics are not unimportant, but if a general relies too much on tactics and tricks, he will fall one day. Marquis Garcia smiled when he saw that Colin was still somewhat puzzled and unconvinced. A fox's wisdom is laughable in the eyes of a lion. I don't want to deny the importance of tactics. I just want to tell you that the most crucial secret to victory on the battlefield is still a powerful army. That's why I said that in this battle, I relied on them, the Black Cavalry. Looking at the first half of my life, the secret to not losing for more than 20 years is the same, the Black Cavalry. Colin fell into deep thought. He finally understood the true meaning of Marquis Garcia's words. Marquis Garcia was actually reminding him not to rely too much on tactics. The implementation of tactics also required strength as a foundation. Previously, he had indeed attached too much importance to these tactics, or even to conspiracies. Night Bliss must have already told Marquis Garcia everything that had happened on the way to escape. Even if Night Bliss did not see it clearly, Colin did not think that Marquis Garcia could not see through his little schemes. It had to be said that Colin was indeed somewhat complacent after the Battle of the River Bend. He thought that he had grasped the secret to victory on the battlefield. Moreover, coming from the era of information explosion, He had always thought that he was experienced and knowledgeable. He knew a little about Sun Tzu's art of war, the 36 stratagems, and so on. Relying on these and some of his own cleverness, it would not be difficult to move unhindered on the battlefield. But fortunately, Marquis Garcia reminded Colin at the right time. Conspiracies and machinations were never the right way. The most mainstream victory on the battlefield was in the end an upright army, the strong defeating the weak. Although this time the trolls were actually the strong side, under Marquis Garcia's careful planning, he kept making the black cavalry stronger on the local battlefield, so that he kept defeating the weak with the strong, and finally defeated the seemingly strong enemy. Moreover, thinking carefully about the tactics that Marquis Garcia had used before. In fact, they were not complicated. First, he pretended to be at odds with the Duke to confuse and numb the trolls. Then, he suddenly led the army to the north, found the location of the Troll Wolf Cavalry's main force, and succeeded in the surprise attack. Later, he kept harassing the troll army that was tired and had lost the protection of the cavalry. Finally, he used the heavy cavalry to find a flaw and defeated them in one blow. The entire plan was not complicated and could not even be considered outstanding. It probably did not even have the qualifications to be recorded in a military book. But Colin, who had personally experienced all of this, was very clear. These steps seemed simple, but they were aimed at the troll army's vital points. Moreover, they pressed on step by step, not giving the enemy the slightest chance to breathe. From the beginning to the end, no matter how the trolls struggled, they could not escape the fate of defeat. Of course, more importantly, Marquis Garcia's elite troops, the number 1 cavalry on the northern frontier, the Black Cavalry. In other words, Marquis Garcia was not only an outstanding commander, but even more amazing, he was probably a talent at training troops. It was because he had personally trained the Black Cavalry that he had the most fundamental foundation for this series of victories. At this point, Colin could no longer suppress the thought that had been hovering in his mind. Marquis Garcia was invincible because of his Black Cavalry. Then, where was my Black Cavalry? The wind and snow were still howling, as if countless wronged and sorrowful spirits were crying. On the icy plains, a large number of troll-surrendered soldiers were gathered together. They were surrounded by the covetous Black Cavalry patrolling the area. A few troll-surrendered soldiers could no longer take it, and couldn't help but shout at the patrolling Black Cavalry soldiers, "Sigh. Brothers, we're really hungry, can't you give us something to eat?" His shout immediately attracted the agreement of his companions. Thus, the scene immediately became noisy. "Yeah, I'm so cold, give me something warm. And my leg. The blood is almost dry, can you treat it for me?" But the surrounding Black Cavalry soldiers turned a deaf ear to the pleas of the troll-surrendered soldiers. Only when some of the surrendered soldiers tried to leave would they be warned and berated by the Black Cavalry, or even arrows and swords. Helpless, the trolls could only wait patiently. This wait went on for who knows how long. Many of the troll-surrendered soldiers who could no longer endure had already lost their breath. But those who were still breathing did not get the result they were hoping for. Marquis Garcia's military order finally came down. Kill all troll-surrendered soldiers. You're tuning in to the Passion Pages YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.